Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you again for joining us for our member position advisory. And of course, I want to, as I was just saying, be mindful of time limits. We're all everyone on here is a WEDI member. So of course, I'm going to go past some of the slides that talk about WEDI membership, but if we could go to the first slide. But I think it's important to point out again some significant dates about the origin of WEDI. Formed in '91. Interesting how, as you look forward, many of us were around when WEDI was formed, and certainly when it was named in '96 into the HIPAA legislation as advisory to HHS. What I wanted to point out is we talk about WEDI's mission as an industry convener, multi-stakeholder leadership, and today is a perfect example of how we are bringing together the members of WEDI, the leadership within WEDI, and we are doing it for a purpose of providing what we consider to be valuable comments to HHS, in this example, to NCVHS. As we talk about the advisory role, I do want to also talk about the collaboration that we enjoy, and that with NCVHS, and on the list today in terms of participation, we have various members within the NCVHS family. It's a pleasure to work collaboratively with our colleagues at NCVHS, and we hope that today will give you some feedback early on in terms of what our members believe are the significant points to be made on the two items under consideration today: the CAQH CORE Operating Rules and the X12 transaction standards. Next slide. And again, not to, this is illustrates the collaborative process that we go through. Next slide, please. We often talk about the volunteers, and you know, my hat's off to all of our volunteers, all of the people who make this WEDI a meaningful organization. I want to start out by just reminding everyone about the WEDI process. In this illustration, we have the work groups and subwork groups and task groups listed. You know, we now have 17. And collaboration and working with all of the organization, with all of the work groups is an important part of the organization. In this case, we're illustrating the two work groups, remittance advice and payments, and the claims as examples of the participation in making today's event a meaningful event. I would like to also say the composition of the WEDI board, before we move to the next slide, is the WEDI board, as a reminder, is 1/3, we always consider it 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 provider representation, 1/3 health plan or payer representation, 1/3 vendor representation, but we have a unique position to have both CMS and ONC sitting on our board in their advisory position. And I just want to recognize that. In addition to the WEDI board, and we just went out yesterday with the election process. So many of you may have received the ballot, but that is exactly how we vote as well. The payer health plan ballots go to the payer membership, provider the same, vendor the same, and that is the way that we bring on our board of directors. And at this point, we are preparing for 2023. And then within our committees, and so in addition to the volunteer groups here, of work groups, task groups, our board of directors, our committees within the WEDI organization do a lot of what you see here. The events, WEDI events, WEDI calendar, and preparing educational sessions and making all of this possible. So recognizing all of our volunteers work for you as a member organization, and it's a pleasure from my perspective to have this honor of being in the leadership at WEDI. Next slide. Today, and we're going to have some elaboration in a few minutes of the individuals that will be moderating. Myself, Nancy from the is the WEDI board chair, and she's from the AMA. Bob Bowman, co-chair of the WEDI policy committee, and he's from CAQH. And Jay Eisenstock will be joining us shortly, who's also co-chair of the WEDI policy committee and the past chair of WEDI. In terms of facilitators, we have Beth Davis, who co-chairs the WEDI claims subwork group. Donna Bowl Campbell from HCSC is the co-chair of eligibility and benefits. Terry Cunningham from AHA co-chairs the WEDI No Surprises Task Group. Pam Grose from PNC Bank co-chairs the WEDI Remittance and Payments. Gail Coker from Blue Cross Blue Shield Association represents the BCBSA representative on the WEDI board, will also be a facilitator. Heather McComas, the co-chair of the prior authorization work group. She's from AMA. Stanley Knockomson, who is also the co-chair of the WEDI claim sub work group from Knockomson Advisors. Chirp Ververka is a co-chair also with Stanley and Terry and others on the WEDI claim sub work group. Pat from Cognizant Remittance and Payment sub work group, you're going to be hearing from shortly as a facilitator. And lastly, this would not be possible without the hard work of Rob Tennant, who is vice president within our federal affairs part of WEDI. Next slide. And I think this is the process where I'm going to be turning it over to our next speaker.
This is Bob Bowman. I can jump in.
Is it? Yeah.
Thanks,
Okay.
Charles. Just as Charles mentioned, we do want to go over the process of what you should expect today, as well as what we've already initiated through that process. The WEDI Policy Committee, chaired by myself and Jay, as mentioned by Charles already, we've modified the PAG, the Policy Advisory Group process, to make changes and updates to it because it had kind of fallen a little behind the times. Actually, there wasn't even an option for a virtual webinar like we're hosting today. And we want to make sure that the edits and changes that we did make to the old process can meet the needs of what WEDI needs to do here now in the present as well as into the future. So the WEDI Board of Directors did approve those changes, and we now have a member position advisory process. Again, this is designed to solicit member input on various issues that come to us, both public and private sector proposals, as well as government regulations. So kind of the scope may be the same, the process that we implement in engender the feedback from our members is going to be it has revised and is now updated. So again, those member perspectives are going to be collected through surveys, through interviews, through face-to-face and virtual events like today. So it encompasses all the different modes of which feedback can be brought in from our membership and ensure that the WEDI Board of Directors can evaluate that feedback in an effective way. That way that WEDI can develop an official response to these types of proposals, either public or private, and through the government regulatory process, and can design a response in a way that is quite effective to meet the needs of both the board and the industry that we serve. We can go to the next slide. Again, the event for today, the MPA event that we're hosting today, it was kicked off and triggered because both CAQH CORE and X12 had sent in letters of recommendation to NCVHS, the National Committee on Vital Health Statistics, to move forward with some new and revised operating rules and to move from the 50-10 to the 80-20 version for the healthcare claim and the remittance advice transactions. Now, I know WEDI has hosted education events on both of these topics in the last month, and much of that discussion and that education component has taken place with the industry over the last couple of months. So again, the intent of today is not to host an education event on what those edits and changes and new rules and new versions are, but to get feedback from our membership on the impact of what that might have for the industry and how we as a group, as WEDI, can propose our own recommendations to NCVHS. So again, WEDI, as part of that process, conducted a survey through September and October to get feedback. We hosted the education sessions, and we're going to be reviewing the results of those surveys and the feedback that we got during the education sessions to ensure that we get the correct type of feedback from our members to write those recommendations for NCVHS. I believe I hand the call over now to Nancy for the next slide. So Nancy.
Hi, everybody. And I'm just going to kind of push through this so we can get to the meat of our session today. But just to give a little refresher here, we do have the role of us being an advisor to NCVHS in the same way that NCVHS is a federal advisory committee to HHS. And whenever NCVHS receives a request to adopt a new or updated operating rule or standard under HIPAA, it needs to solicit input from the industry in order to make its recommendations to the secretary. So NCVHS has scheduled a hearing for January 18th and 19th, and they will be hearing testimony at that time from invited industry stakeholders. The hearing, though, is open for everybody to listen to, and there are opportunities during their hearings for public comments. So if you're not invited, you still have an opportunity to provide comments at that level. But they've also published for this particular topic, subject matter, they published a request for comment, and anyone can respond to that. So this is another opportunity for you to get your positions, your feedback straight to NCVHS. And you know, they're really looking for, we'll go through the questions today as through our discussion, and you'll see exactly what they're looking for. And then the process that happens is NCVHS will make a recommendation to the secretary. And then if that recommendation is to move forward with an adoption, then the next step will be for CMS to publish a notice of proposed ruling. So that is the process and where the work that we're doing today fits into that larger picture of what's going to happen. So next slide. We have the agenda here for how we're going to move through our session today. We're going to do the best we can to stick with these times, but we've realized that we don't have, it appears, any non-members participating today. So we're going to save that public input time and use that for extending our discussion with each session. If it does happen that we get some non-members participating, then we'll use some of that time for any opportunity for them to provide comments. Just in general, if you're going to be making a comment, you can just raise your hand to speak and you'll be unmuted, or you can type your comments into the chat, and someone from the facilitating group will raise those comments, questions that get put into the chat. So next slide up. I guess maybe that's where, yeah, that's where it's showing the chat function, hand raise function. Next slide. Okay, I'm going to turn you over to our first facilitators.
This is Donna. I can jump in here. One of the first questions that I know I have to the participants of today's call is really, what consternation do we have, if any, and or what high support do we have for moving the operating rules that have been proposed forward? Those include both the new operating rules that have to do with the prior authorization, and then the updated operating rules that have to do with the eligibility and benefit and claim status operating rules that are in place and mandated today. I thought I'd kick it off with that open question to kind of engage the feedback and that appetite. And then Terry and Gail and Heather, do you guys have anything you want to chime in with just to support what we're looking for?
No, I think that's a good way to start it. I mean, if people are willing to jump in there, just obviously we can give a little bit more of an overview of it, but hopefully people have had the opportunity to review the operating rules as they're proposed, and can give us just kind of their initial reactions, and we can kind of go from there.
Right. So of those operating rules, we have the connectivity rule that has been updated. It's in place today. The federally mandated infrastructure rules. Those are the infrastructure rules that have to do with the E&B, or eligibility and benefit 270, 271, the claim status 276, 277, and the 835 payment and remittance advice, TR3s, and the operating rules that support those. We also have seen updates to the data content rule for the E&B transaction, expanding on the existing requirements. And then there are new rules that have been drafted and CORE approved, and now are moving forward for the recommendation that have to do with the attachments to both the prior authorization and the attachments that have to do with the healthcare claim. And then both of those would have infrastructure and data content requirements. And then we have the operating rule that is newly proposed for the single patient attribution that has to do with the value-based care models of payment and associations between the patient and their attributed providers in the VPC environment. Those are the list of what the operating rules that have come out of the CORE drafting process and approval process are requesting and recommending move forward. So we have a poll that we would like to get some gauge of where we sit when it comes to our awareness and familiarity with the operating rules that we just described. Do you see yourself as very knowledgeable in the content infrastructure and the new and updated rules, somewhat knowledgeable, slightly knowledgeable, or you have not much information to go on? I'm not sure when the poll ends, if it has ended. At least on the initial numbers, this is perfect timing because it's election season for so many of us. It looks like there is a very large number of folks who are very and or somewhat knowledgeable. Roughly 38% are very, 38% are somewhat, and there is about 13% that are slightly and 13% that are not knowledgeable on the operating rules. So that is a good number. That means that when we're requesting your feedback and gauging the support of the operating rules, that we're coming from a place of familiarity, which is good. So
Yep.
I'm going.
I would
Go
just encourage when it opens next time, if others can, if more people can participate, if these are going to be the impetus off of which we base kind of our discussions, 8 people out of 47's not going to cut it in terms of it really guiding our discussions. I understand there might have been some timing issues, so no big deal. But
Hey, Terry,
tough to
this is
draw any-
Michael. I'm
Yep,
going
go
to
ahead.
relaunch the poll for another 15 seconds. Okay, I'm going to relaunch the poll.
Thanks,
Yeah,
Mike.
and as a reminder, especially to the moderators, don't close the poll before Michael does.
Yeah, I
Yeah, we're
haven't.
getting more folks now. That's great.
Hey, this is Heather. Michael and Rob, just so the facilitators know, can everyone see the results coming in, or is that just a facilitator thing? I think part of it might be that we're not sure who can see what
Yeah.
on their screen.
I'm not necessarily sure, so it might be best if the moderators could read off the results.
Right. So I can see it on the screen. And we have, like Terry pointed out, we have a much larger body of participants that responded now. It looks like roughly 32 people have responded. And it looks like the poll is ended. Out of that 32, 22% of them said they're very knowledgeable with the operating rules. 44% said they're somewhat knowledgeable. 25% said slightly knowledgeable, and just under 10%, 9% said they are not knowledgeable. So still pretty good chunk of folks that are knowledgeable or have some awareness, at least that's great. And then it looks like a very heavy, roughly 66% or 2/3 of the group are somewhat or very knowledgeable of the details within the operating rules that are being discussed today.
I wasn't sure. Should we go back a slide?
Well, I would think, are there any comments that we want to address in the comment in the chat? Is there any, I know that we're soliciting and trying to gauge the appetite for moving these forward from our WEDI membership and the participants on the call. So,
Donna, it's Rob. Yeah, we've got a comment coming in from David stating these rules are foundational to progress forward on more advanced and improved capabilities that support EPA and other advancing capabilities. They are in support of the current burden reduction rule in OMB.
yes, I would.
Thank you, David.
Yep, thank you. Is there anyone else who would like to give us either feedback in the chat, especially if we don't have any member organizations, we can open, or non-member organizations, you know, we can devote the time to the full body to review in detail what the support, or if there is a lack of support, the lack of support and potentially the reason for, and then discuss the impacts, because we definitely want to find out from the participants what, if there is support or if there isn't support, regardless of which direction this group goes, what are the foundational reasons for the one or the other? Is it ROI or cost benefit? Is it just anything that you guys have had an opportunity, if you are familiar with those operating rules, that you can use as why you would thumbs up or thumbs down as a WEDI member the proposal to move these forward. And go ahead, Rob, I think you were about to say something.
Yeah, two things. We've got a comment that says the operating rules were not developed in response to the Burden Reduction Act. While they may provide support, that is not the genesis for their development. So it's an important point. And as a reminder to the facilitators, as soon as you're ready to move to the next slide, just let Michael know.
Sounds great. And I think, I mean, just to reiterate something that Donna established, obviously the whole point of this is for us to take in the position of all of you, things that we need to include in our response, things that we need to discuss and consider in order for us to come up with a fully reflective view as to whether or not the industry should move forward with these or not, and what are some of the key reasons that this absolutely is necessary, that this is timely, anything along those that you would like to see in a letter. If not, now's the time to make sure it's raised, because that's what we're trying to do here. So I don't know if we're able to unmute. I see we've got Mike's hand raised.
Yes. Yeah,
okay.
I believe we can unmute them. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Sorry, I didn't know the technology. So Mike.
Okay, I've been unmuted. Yeah, I just wanted to comment to Donna's question around support or not. I think we really need to take them each separately and discuss them. I think that obviously, like things like the CAQH core connectivity rule, which hasn't been updated in some time, and the infrastructure rules, which haven't been updated in some time. I believe there's support, especially in the connectivity rule, where the current mandated rule has known security vulnerabilities, and obviously those should be addressed and have been addressed in the recent version 4 updates, as well as allowing the use of API-friendly connectivity methods such as OAuth 2, SOAP, and REST. So I think that those are things to be discussed. But in general, I think we need to, call out each individually and really discuss them.
So I'm going to use that as a jumping off point, Mike, to ask you and the others, if there was an option, let's just say if there was an option for us to make a recommendation and say, we want to see these moved in some order or not altogether, for example, would there be support in that vein, or are we thinking that potentially these should move forward as I'm going to use the quote, suite? So all of the operating rules would be recommended to NCVHS for adoption and ask that they all be implemented with similar or the same effective dates, so they'd all be live on the same day. Do we have an idea of the feel for either one of those paths? Not even just in the conversation here and break them down, but do we want to even think about or talk about with this group whether or not this should be a one swoop, an all or nothing thing? If we make a recommendation, we want to see them all adopted, or we want to see certain ones adopted before others. And then there was a request from Susan to go back to the listed slide. Yeah, that slide. Thank you. So do we, if you want to jump to the chats, we can see about, you're welcome, Susan. So the question on the operating rules would be, do we want to see each of these, knowing that some are brand new? Those are the authorization attachment items that we were talking about, and the patient attribution. And then some of them exist, but they have updates with them. Do we expect that we would support moving all of them forward? Or do we want to say, would we want to recommend moving the ones that exist today forward first, and then move the other ones forward second, the new ones, or vice versa? That is something I'm interested in hearing, what people's opinions are. I don't know if Terry, Gail, and Heather have the same interest, but I know I do. I wonder what we all feel.
Why don't we go to David, who's raised his hand, and then there's a couple of comments from the chat.
Okay, yeah, hi everybody. This is Dave Delano from Nehan. We've been tracking this closely, and it has a big impact on our members here in the New England area. we believe that the connectivity rule actually has benefit across many different use cases, as I think someone just described, in support of API-based exchange capabilities, and also in support of the attachments rules and other capabilities, as I described earlier, around the integration or the capabilities for support of the burden reduction and EPA rules. So we think that one is actually foundational, or sort of integrates with and supports all of the, not necessarily all the others, but we think that one really is the most important to get out there first. Some of the others, certainly the EPA, having the EPA status coming back in an eligibility 270, 271 transaction is also important for our interest, particularly because it supports the other more advanced capabilities around EPA. And then, of course, all the attachments related items, in our opinion, should be bundled together, because that's sort of one set of use case scenarios there in support of claims and or prior auths. So there's, to me, a logical bundling of these activities, if that makes any sense to folks, with the connectivity rules sort of being foundational to all of them. My opinion, or our opinion. Thanks.
Hey, it's Heather, and our chime in with something, and I certainly invite Bob and Aaron at CORE to jump in and keep me honest here. But one thing I would note about all the infrastructure rules, I believe, and whether they are updates or updates to federally mandated rules or new ones, is that they all would follow the same system availability requirement, moving it up to 90%. And I believe during the rulemaking process, there was concern previously expressed by CORE members that having some transactions on one system availability requirement and others on another would just be unwieldy. So I'll just throw that out there to folks. That might be a rationale for keeping the infrastructure rules bucketed together. I'll let people react to that.
Looks like I'm still unmuted. This is Dave, so I'll take advantage. We agree with that as well on the infrastructure rules.
Yeah, I'll just jump in with some comments from the chat. Diana recommends adopting all of the 80-20 standard transactions at once. We'll probably dive deeper into that a little bit later today. Aaron from CAQH states, to clarify, items 1 to 3 on the slide now all have a current federally mandated version. CAQH CORE has proposed updated versions to replace the currently mandated version of these rules. Diana, and we'll get to this a little bit later as well, but she mentions, she argues getting attachments for claims and prior auth and the 999 acknowledgements should go first, and then second choice would be the 80-20 transactions. Nancy states secondarily to moving them all together or piecemeal. If recommendation is to adopt them all, should there be a longer implementation time for the new rules? A good question for folks to ponder. And Marilee states, my recommendation is, I think, connectivity followed by attachments, and then if appropriate, patient attribution. And let me see here, we've got Stanley saying, is there an issue with adopting the attachments operating rules before we know the attachment standard? We actually get to that a little bit later. We've got a poll question on that. And Donna raises the question, and to piggyback, have any of the WEDI members conducted an assessment to measure impact on their organization, cost and effort, for example? I think that's one of the things NCVHS is very interested in, is what would be the cost, and obviously weighing that against the potential benefits that operating rules and standards would have on the organization.
And to piggyback off myself, I'm wondering, will people take their experience from, say, the first sets of operating rules when they implemented the connectivity and the infrastructure rule, the system availability, the companion guide requirements, and the data content rule for the EMB, and then when it floated to the claim status and then the 835 with the payment advice, will people use those as like guardrails on what they expect the new operating rules and or the updated operating rules may take in their organization to implement? And then if they aren't going to use that, because I know, a lot of people have said that the operating rules were relatively new to those who weren't voluntarily adopting them. So now that they've had they've danced with the operating rules from phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, that they have some footing. So therefore they don't necessarily think they'd have to invest as much time, maybe the same amount of energy when it comes to, going through just your natural life cycle, but that the cost, because of their familiarity with the previous operating rule implementation, wouldn't be as much. There's, that question out to folks. Are you gonna use the same costs from the first, second, and third operating rules that were mandated and really base it on those? Or are you going to do a deep dive assessment and basically start from scratch and come up with a new assessment of cost and effort for these sets, if they were to move forward? Any feedback in the chat? Anybody want to give any of? Yeah.
Yeah, not on that issue, Donna, but what strikes me as well is organizations may have done an analysis on previous operating rules, and that might be helpful as a guidepost to get a sense of what these updated and new operating rules would cost in terms of time and money and staffing.
Yeah, and that brings up a great point, because I know, a lot of organizations I've talked to in my own organization as well. There's not always that we call it a lessons learned or a postmortem after projects to evaluate the estimate versus actual into the dollars and cents. So I don't know if anyone did do that when they did implement the operating rules for the 270, 276, 835, and have now known, if they estimated a certain amount of money that was going to cost, and then a certain timeline that it was going to take. And then at the end of the day, when it was all said and done, were they on the mark? Were they under? Did they overburn? Did they underburn? Or were they, great at their estimation technique? And if they are, please come to my organization, help us sometimes. Because I know that, I think there's a lot of peeling back the onion when you get into the meat, when you see something for the first time around, and then the second and third time around, you kind of get used to it. So maybe, say, for example, the updated rules may not take as much, but the new rules might have to go through their own evolution, because it's a different dynamic. It's a different set of transactions. Some organizations haven't had to deal with attachments before, or they're just jumping into it with the concept of interoperability. So there's potential that maybe people are not yet real sure what it would take to do the new operating rules, but they're pretty solid and confident on what it would take to update the operating rules for the ones that have been previously mandated. And I see Susan made a comment that said they would build on the existing operating rules, not start from scratch.
And she added as well, the implementation order that Susan recommends, the connectivity rule, updated federally mandated OP rules, the new eligibility and benefits rule, and then the 4 attachments rule. So be interested for other folks to weigh in on Susan's list if that's what they think would be the best order. And I think the other issue here, which I think, Donna, you alluded to, is folks will be building on existing structures, and they will have had to have gone through this, so they know the process. So moving to a new, even a new operating rule, the process would be the same, so that might cut some of the cost for organizations down a little bit.
Yeah, and I would also emphasize that, you know, a lot of organizations that I've talked to, just these are just casual conversations, nothing formalized, but they take the opportunities when there's mandates to enrich their system and or modernize their system. So I would say we want to be careful when we're gauging that cost and that implication that could happen as a result of the operating rules moving forward. And I don't know that we would want to capture those I call them magic moments, because you get lucky that you have to rewrite a system, or you get lucky that you get to touch a system, and in that effort you're also going to modernize it. So we would want to be careful to capture what it would truthfully take and the impact you have on your system based on the raw requirements that would come through in the operating rules. And again, probably separate from that any modernization needs that maybe an organization might have to implement these in addition to whatever they're trying to do their system.
Great, and we've got some comments in the chat. David writes, we have not done a deep analysis of the cost impact of implementing these rules. We see more risk to the industry in not progressing toward these capabilities, even incrementally. Beth writes, our organizations would need to build from scratch and have not yet gauged a cost impact. And Mike adds to Stanley's earlier question, as we heard in Rich Landon's presentation during the WEDI National Conference, as federally codified operating rules can only support standards under HIPAA regulation. All good points.
So it sounds like, and this is just me reading those comments and hearing them as they're restated, that there has been some attempt to familiarize themselves. Folks have made an attempt to become aware of what the operating rules are requiring, what they're addressing, and that the next step is potentially those organizations doing the gap analysis and or the impact assessment and or the cost benefit analysis. And so taking that in those two divides, one, if we don't know the costs yet, we might not be able to tap to that side of what it sounds like NCVHS would like to know when it comes to us giving and providing feedback. But do we, the message I'm getting from the chat is, for sure, there is definitely an appetite to move forward. Maybe the appetite is different depending on the organization's feedback on whether or not it's one thing or if it's staggered, or at least, you know, some start stop, so to speak. So starting with the connectivity rule, then moving to the updates, then moving to the new rules, or starting with the connectivity rule, moving to the updates, bringing in the attribution rule, and then the attachments. Depending on our feelings on that order, sure sounds like there is support, at least with the 4, 5, 6 people who have chimed in on the chat, that there is support to move forward. Like we could say, we can put a pin in it and say, there is definitely support to move forward with these operating rules. New or update, altogether or separate, there is definitely support.
Yeah, I would catch up on the, take a look at the chat for a second. I think Marilee made a comment while you were talking that you probably haven't seen. I think there is some concern about one of the new the attribution data content rule and the impact that would be. So what I'm reading from her comment is that that one, Mary Louise, you're typing like me. Way to go.
Okay, yep, I'm reading it.
And Donna's gonna laugh because she sees a lot of typos from me. And then I think what I'm hearing is that that one at least might require some additional effort and review before we would put that in the move forward bucket with some of the other ones. At least that's what I'm reading from the comment.
Yeah, and
Okay.
let me catch up a bit with the chat as well. Diana has written, our organization would be able to expand on our current system to meet these new changes, but we have not done a deep cost analysis yet. We know it will be a lot, but not as much as starting over completely from scratch. So I think that's a message as well, that, you know, we have gone through these before. So that gives us a little bit of sense of what it's going to take to move forward. Crystal says the attachments operating rules should not move forward until there is HHS attachments rule. We do have a poll question on that, so we'll try to gauge what folks think about that. And again, Crystal says at this point we do not know exactly what the attachments rule will include. And Beth says, I agree with Crystal. So I think there's a lot of interest in the timing of the attachments rule and the attachments operating rules. And Diana agrees with Crystal as well. So yeah, we'll have a poll on that coming up. Yep.
Hey, Rob, it's Heather. Kind of pursuing this idea on, you know, having an attachment standard before, you know, proceeding with mandating the attachments operating rules. What interested is kind of a little bit of a nuance on that. What would folks feel about recommending that the long-awaited little C attachments rule both mandate a standard and the associated operating rules? What would folks feel about doing that simultaneously, particularly because we've been waiting such a long time for any guidance on this? Would people be open to that approach?
Mary Lee says, I would agree with that recommendation. Beth says yes as well. How do others feel about it? And while folks are kind of weighing in on that, I wanted to, we had a comment that this health plan has not done an analysis for the patient attribution rule, but we only have about 10% of our millions of members within value-based care, value-based payments arrangements. So that's another issue as well, that it may not impact all lines of business and all of their members within a health plan's organization. So something to keep in mind. A few others have weighed in. David says, I agree with that. Mike says, good question. Heather, it would depend if they are aligned. Chuck says yes. Monica says yes. Cindy agrees with Crystal on her earlier comment. And Diana says, yes, we need to get attachments moving in the industry. So the argument, I think what we're hearing with attachments is, if we do them in tandem, it could save potentially a year or more and would bring additional benefits to the transaction once the transaction itself went live. So that seems to be the consensus with folks, but great question to ask, Heather.
And then to throw a little secondary question in this batch, I wonder, you know, I know, like Heather and team have said, you know, the attachments has been, I think people have been drooling for the attachments to become mandated. And for whatever reason, I don't know if it's, you know, the format or if it's just there hasn't been a strong push until now, and it's become more evident with the interoperability needs. I wonder if people aren't already doing attachments, and the attachments rules, even if it hasn't been mandated, if people are supporting them today, it might be easier to again, using the term appetite, there might be a better appetite or a stronger appetite to say, sure, we'll accept operating rules if we aren't mandated to use an attachment, say, for example, the 275, but we're still exchanging it. We would still like to have operating rules that help shepherd how to do it and in context of with the prior authorization and the claims, as opposed to saying you're required to support attachments. Oh, and then also you're required to support the infrastructure and data content rules. I would think it would be similar to what we've heard in many of the forums with respect to the operating rules. It's the floor, not the ceiling. So if in fact you exchange or have attachments protocols today, whether it be through, your portal or whether it be built through the 275 or some other CDE implementation, that there'd be infrastructure and data content rules would govern that use. And then it may help in, not just now, but maybe when we reevaluate and continue to evaluate and we continue to iterate, then we see the value of the attachments to then know whether or not the expansion to requiring attachments makes sense versus still requiring adherence to operating rules that govern the exchange or the transaction, or I'll call it exchange. And then we don't necessarily have to mandate the attachments, because if people are self-doing it, they're doing it to save money for themselves. So anyone who doesn't want to save money, obviously, they don't need a rule to tell them to do something if we know it's meant to cut costs. So I would say that, this might be an opportunity to think out of the box a little bit here. And again, use what we've heard from CAQH CORE in many forums, which is it's the floor, not the ceiling.
Yeah, and we've got a couple of comments in the chat. Mary Lee says, I'm going to be honest here, combined attachments, some combined the operating rules and the standard may hold a higher priority. We actually asked that question in our WEDI survey, and there was strong consensus around the idea that a 275 attachment standard would hold immediate value for the industry, and it should be prioritized as opposed to perhaps moving ahead with other improvements to existing transactions. Of course, we cannot blame NCVHS. I believe they have sent 4 letters of recommendation to CMS encouraging the rule, so we can't blame them. We do have a comment from Margaret. We already built the 275, but don't know what the final standard version would be. So there may be changes, but operating rules would be a smaller effort. We still need a standard, not necessarily a rule. Many are using different versions. Very important. David mentions the new connectivity rule allows for multiple payload types. We should allow and support multiple methods, X12, CDA, FHIR, of exchanging content, including attachments. Mike clarified his earlier comment, meaning it would depend if the developed and proposed attachment operating rules are fully aligned with the quote, yet to be named transaction standard. So I think we're hearing a lot of consensus around the idea that we need to get the attachments rule and supporting operating rules out there so the industry can take advantage. Diana says our organization accepts attachments via paper, fax, snail mail, and portal. We do not have a 275 transaction as we are waiting for a mandate. Then we will run with it. So I think the 275 is being used a little bit in the industry, but I think a mandate would really push the standard forward. So, and I think we've got some poll slides, Donna and gang. So I think we can probably keep moving forward and make sure that we hit all of the NCVHS questions and do our polls.
Yeah, let's do it.
Rob, should I continue to advance slides?
Yeah, I think,
Yeah, I think we've hit on the comment on the potential for improvements in efficiency.
yeah, so I
But we
think
didn't necessarily hone in on the system availability specifically. Do we have any feedback on that going from 86% to 90%? And
Quick question, were we asking people to do another poll? Just now?
Michael, I think you can go to the next slide. I think there should be, yeah, you can go
Okay.
to,
And then I think they need to go to the drop down in the polling and select question 2, I believe. Because people were saying they didn't know how to get to the poll.
gotcha, good. All right. And again, please take advantage of these polls. The more data we have, the better.
should we keep the poll open about 10, 15 more seconds? I see still.
Yep, sounds
Okay.
good.
All right, ending poll.
Okay, so the question in this poll was rate the level of potential improvement in efficiency that these eligibility and benefit operating rules would contribute to your organization. 30 people responded. It appears 10% of the 30 believe that it's significant improvements in efficiency would result. 37% believe there is improvement in efficiency. 30% believe there'll be no change in efficiency. 7% believe there'll be decreased efficiency. No one believes there's significant decrease in efficiency, 0%. And about 17% said they do not know. So we're, again, around the 67% mark of no change or an improvement in the efficiency for the eligibility and benefit operating rules.
One thing that might be helpful, and I know we might be short on time, but this is obviously just a poll of all members on the call. Some of the benefits are tailored to one side or another. So, if people have specific reasons why they believe that it's going to be efficient, it would be good to know, is this a health plan speaking? Is it a provider speaking? Is it a vendor speaking? Just because I think that gives us a better understanding as to what efficiencies are truly important and who are they important to.
Yeah, and just to add a couple of comments from the chat. The argument is that healthcare is a 24/7 event, and that increased system availability is very important to allow those transactions to flow really 24 hours a day if possible, because again, you may have situations where healthcare needs to be delivered on holidays or the weekends, and that's an important component to this rule. And Tyler says he agrees 100% with Terry on that last comment. Mike asks, does it include the new / proposed patient attribution rule? And I don't believe it does.
No, that was just on the
eligibility and benefits. Yeah.
Yeah,
Exactly.
I believe it was on the move from the 86% to the 90%. For sure.
Chris does mention with great increase in patching required, there is now a greater need for system downtime, even if just for one piece. So it's an important comment as well.
So before we move on to the patient attribution section, quickly, are there any final comments on the efficiency EMB operating rule piece? If none, we'll briefly do this next section. This has to do, again, we talked about this earlier, the VPC, the value-based payments, value-based care programs, and the patient attribution. This particular content rule is brand new, and it's asking whether or not your organization has done an analysis of that operating rule, and if so, what do you think the operating rule requirements support in terms of administrative simplification? I believe there's a poll after this, if I remember. Yes. So I think what Gail had said, you're going to want to make sure you select poll question number 3.
Ending the poll.
Okay. So this poll question was, rate the level of potential benefits to the value-based care that would be associated with the new eligibility and benefit data content rule regarding the patient attribution. There were 26 respondents to this poll, and the breakdown was 4% believe it significantly improves the benefits. There's significantly improved benefits. There's 35% said somewhat improved benefits. 12% said no change in benefits. No one had said there'd be somewhat decreased benefits. 8% said significant decrease in benefits, and 42% had no opinion. So 42% of the 26 respondents, so almost half, had no opinion.
And just to add a comment from the chat, Mary Lee says for patient attribution, we talked already about the small population it is supporting compared to the very large who are not in a value-based care model. The model is so small at this point that many processes are not yet automated. I think a good point. And then she adds, this creates the need for special database through which millions of transactions would need to be run, potentially degrading overall response time for all. Thank you for adding those comments.
And I would ask, being a facilitator, I'm merely challenging for the sake of challenge. What would be the implication for that small percent if it wasn't recommended for adoption? Do we have gaps in care or gaps in just in air quote benefits, not eligibility and benefits, with how to handle these type of arrangements more strategically, more consistently? Or are we not seeing a problem? Maybe we're not seeing it because we don't have the dedicated requirements, or maybe we just don't have the problem that we think we'd need a solution for. Do we have an opinion on that? Have we not seen implications by not having rules? Have we not really experienced any negative problems? So there hasn't really been a push for rules or push for consistency within organizations. I guess I'm wondering what is the basis for even that small 8% that thinks that there'll be a significant decrease in benefits, and or the 35% that say there's somewhat improved benefits by having a patient attribution rule?
I guess one thought is that you know, as more and more value-based care contracts are being conducted between payers and providers, any way to improve the data flow and to improve the process of delivering care benefits both sides. So I guess there's an argument that although the numbers may be small, is this yet another opportunity to encourage value-based care arrangements? And yeah, and Marilee says, I feel this is a chicken and egg. I think we seem to be trying to build a solution to allow growth, but we don't have enough to support the design. Very important point. And then David says there would then be need to be continued manual and out of band methods for determining patient attribution in value-based care programs. It's awkward today. So I think that is the, and again, Mike says, I agree with Mary Lee, the patient attribution rule is directionally correct, but maybe ahead of overall industry adoption of value-based care. So it's really Mary Lee's chicken and egg scenario, I think, is absolutely correct. Do you start and try to push the industry, or do you wait for the industry to move forward and then come in behind them to support? So I'm not sure we have an answer for that, but if others want to weigh in on the chicken and egg issue, please do. And I think we can probably move to the next slide as well.
So I see the next section is the focus is the companion guide template. So they've updated, CAQH CORE has updated the requirements for the companion guide. Most of us are familiar with the companion guide, but obviously as the operating rules move forward, a lot of the incidental rules and artifacts have to move forward with it. So we would like to know your organization's experience with that companion guide template on the first set of rules and how it's impacted your workflow, whether or not you found there's benefit, and then if you've done an assessment, what that assessment is of the proposed new template. So there's another poll. Make sure you pick poll number 4. Oh, did we not have a poll for this one? Or did we jump right into it? Oh yeah, there we go. Oh, so we got to go back. Sorry. I thought there was another poll in between there. So there's the companion guide, and then we have the connectivity, which you heard from several folks talking about the different security methodologies, OAuth, etc. We also have the different exchange types where you can do it in REST-based and SOAP, the existing SOAP XML. You can do API technologies. It also has a bit more meat when it comes to expanding to other exchange types like the HL7 FHIR protocol. So those operating rules that are specific to the connectivity have expanded and become, I would say this is where we're showing more modernization. And the security piece, like Christopher pointed out, you know, we're constantly battling those patching moments, especially with respect to security and a lot of the hacking that's happening and the attempts that are being made. So keeping in mind these security measures that have been built in the connectivity rule also allow still for what we do today, with obviously the added confidence that the support goes further. So we can move to the poll number 4 about the connectivity rule. And this one is asking specifically based on the piece that we just reviewed. Again, be sure you pick poll 4. I don't know that you can jump ahead, but I wouldn't want to see someone stalled. You guys were fast on this one. A big bunch of you responded right away. So
Closing the
hopefully,
poll.
yep. Okay, so the poll is closed. 26 participants responded to this poll, roughly 53% of the population here. Of that 53% that voted and polled, we have 31% believe the potential benefits associated with the new connectivity operating rule will provide significantly improved benefits. Another 31% said somewhat improved benefits. 15% said no change in benefits. 4% said somewhat decreased benefits. 4% said significant decreased benefits. And about 15% of you said you don't know. I think it's somewhat self-explanatory. I also know, you know, it's a challenge keeping the requirements of connectivity because it is very technical in nature. It may, if people aren't as familiar with the technologies and the security protocols and the different mechanisms for connectivity just in your organization, it might be hard to gauge the improvements or even know what those improvements are. So it definitely shows me, you know, 15% is a pretty average number for a very either technical but not security based, or a very business and not technical based set of respondents. I don't know that there's really much we can move on about this. Do we have any comments? I don't see any comments. Okay, so I'd say we can move on because I know we have a couple more in this section that we need to get to. We have costs. So there is a question about costs. So we briefly tapped on this earlier, if we've done a cost analysis, and I think it was pretty clear, at least through the original part of the chat, that a lot of us haven't done any costs or impact assessments when it comes to the financial implications. But to those of you who have, we are wondering if you've done that cost analysis and what are some of the operational or system or estimated costs that impact? What do you think it would be? And then the second question in this group was, in what programmatic ways do the updates for the operating rule for the infrastructure, again, system availability and response time, the data content, which puts the additional requirements on what you're to support, the data elements that have been mandated in the operating rules for telemedicine, prior authorization, coverage, tiered benefits, and procedure level information. How do those add value to your organization? And then the ask was to provide examples. It may be a little premature to provide some examples if we haven't done the analysis yet, but if you have, we can move, I believe, to the next poll. Is there one more after this? I think there was 6 in this section. Yes, we can answer this poll to rate the level of potential benefits associated with the updated infrastructure operating rules.
Ending the poll.
Okay. Our participants are decreasing. We have 23 participants, less than 50%, who participated in this poll. The response to the question, rate the level of potential benefits associated with the updated infrastructure operating rules, is as follows. We had 22% believe there's significantly improved benefits, 43% believe there's somewhat improved benefits, 13% believe there's no change in benefits, 0% for both somewhat and significant decrease in benefits, and about 22% said they do not know. So the upper quadrant is almost 66% say there's somewhat or significantly improved benefits. That's impressive. And I don't know if we have any comments in the poll about, or in the chat. I don't see anything that has to do with the particulars on any examples and or any of their feelings on any of the data, content, infrastructure, system availability, et cetera. So we will move on.
Just as a reminder for folks completing the polls, if you're not sure, please let us know. It's, if you don't know if there is, for example, a potential benefit, please answer the poll as don't know. That still gives us good information to pass on. So just as an encouragement.
Thank you. So the next slide deals with some alternatives that were considered for operating rules. We wanted to know what are the consequences if NCVHS recommends the adoption of the updated rules and the eligibility or benefit or eligibility and benefit or claim status operating rules. And then if you could provide any of those specific examples for the ROI to indicate what we believe those benefits are for each of the operating rules. So there, we went through the variety of different operating rules. Then we also are going to move into the new rules. So this section, really from this slide forward, we're just, are there any alternatives that were considered? Is there anything else within the eligibility or claim status operating rules that you feel we should consider and or haven't been considered? And then any of the impacts that you believe are should be included in each of those operating rules. If you could provide that feedback, whether it's now or in separate cover to WEDI, that would be appreciated. And then we're moving to the next section that deals with the prior authorization, infrastructure and data content rules, and the healthcare claim infrastructure and data content rules with respect to attachments. And since I know that Heather and Terry, I know Heather is very interested in the prior authorization and Terry in the No Surprises Act and so forth and so on, I'm going to ask for them to chime in on this section.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Donna, and Terry, please jump in and help me out here. So I think we've talked a little bit about this already. It's already come up, and it's obviously that there's a lot of interest in this group already about moving forward with something to get some standardization in electronic attachments. The operating rules on this total of 4, an infrastructure and a data content rule for both the prior authorization and healthcare claims attachment use cases. The infrastructure, getting into some of the questions of things like system availability, et cetera, and the data content rules, getting into things like about being able to match up the attachment with the associated transaction, kind of reassociation issues. Go ahead to the next slide, Michael, please. I think there's a poll question. So let's go ahead and open up poll question number 6, and please indicate your level of assessment of the potential benefits of the attachments rule. And I think we have them kind of lumped together, both prior auth and claims, looks like. All right. Oh, we're still moving. And I see Marilee's comment. I think it's fair in the chat that it's hard to really say anything without the underlying standards. But you know, it sounds like some people feel like there could be benefit. It looks like 17. Go ahead. Oops, got another. We have more people voting for attachments. That's exciting. People obviously are.
Ending the poll.
Go ahead. Okay. So looks like we had 31 total responses, and as Heather tries to do math in her head, which is always a terrifying thing, looks like about 55% of respondents said that they saw significant or somewhat improved benefits to moving forward with the attachments operating rule. Minimal, kind of 3%, no change, 3%. Somewhat decreased. And then we did have a decent chunk, 39% said that they don't know. So I think that's fair to say folks might not be sure, and very good reason, as Marilee indicated in the chat, that reason behind that is we don't have an underlying standard mandate. But it looks like, you know, there is at least some favorable feeling towards moving forward with the attachments operating rule. Go forward to the next slide. I think we have another poll question on this, if I'm remembering correctly. Oh, at least it's just kind of an open question. And this is getting, again, at the whole, who comes first, the standard or the operating rule? And it sounds like that we did have some, maybe at least mild consensus that, you know, would make sense to bundle a standard mandate and an operating rule mandate in the same NPRM. It sounds like there was some appetite for that. I see some comments coming in the chat. See Alex saying the base standard for attachments needs to be discussed by industry to ensure our current viable approach is determined first. I think it's, oops, sorry, what?
And one from Stanley as well, who says we could always recommend that operating rules for non-HIPAA transactions be implemented by the industry, since they can't be adopted under regulation.
I think the attachment space is particularly challenging because it is being called for under regulation, right? It occurs, it's in the legislation. We just haven't been able to centralize around an attachment regulation yet. And so I think that comment is something worth discussing. I don't know if it necessarily fits the this discussion, particularly because we are, you know, there's currently an attachments rule at OMB, but in general, I understand what Stanley's saying, and that's certainly something to consider. I'm trying to see. Oh, we've already seen that scenario. I'm reading some of the other comments. I apologize. And I you know, I didn't vote in the poll, but I totally get the. I want to reiterate what Heather said. I think the don't knows in this scenario, the reason they're so high is because it's not necessarily maybe unfamiliarity with the operating rules. The don't knows could just be, we don't know what's in the regulation. We don't, and you know, I'm speaking specifically as it relates to like the prior authorization attachment. It's difficult to assess the benefits it's going to provide, as there is a completely different prior authorization rule that's also at OMB. So there's so many kind of unknowns that are all going to be implicated in determining prior auths that I expected there to be a heightened don't know on this one. And I think it's something that it'll be a challenge as we figure out the best way to attach, because to comment, because on the one hand, our industry has been calling for movement in this space for so long. And, you know, I'd be the first one at the front of that line to say any movement we could do. I think we've centralized some really strong concepts in the operating rules, but I totally get the concern to the trepidation with there's these two other massive unknowns that really are likely going to impact the benefits that are provided by this rule. So anyways, I think it's an interesting concept to establish in our comments.
And Terry, Alex states the 2016 recommendation to the National Standards Group leveraged meaningful use era thinking, not 21st century cures thinking. Very important point. Mike says the attachment operating rules cannot be federally mandated without a regulated named attachment standard, but could potentially be recommended for voluntary industry adoption. And Crystal agrees with Alex's comment. And I think we can move to the next slide.
And I'll just say, just to follow up to Mike's, I'm pretty sure NCVHS already recommended voluntary adoption of the attachment standards. I know CAQH CORE put them forth in 2020 for mandating, and I believe NCVHS recommended not doing so. I don't know if there's been any, recommendation by the HHS, but I know NCVHS recommended voluntary adoption for a lot of the prior auth and claims attachment rule, or the prior auth attachment rule, at least in 2020. So I'm not sure. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, when you're done there, Terry, I actually believe that we're at time in another minute, so we need to be cognizant of that.
Yeah, I think we have two more polls. So let's get through the polls here if we can. So this one is, should NCVHS recommend adoption of the new attachments operating rules prior to publication of a proposed rule establishing an attachment standard? And I think we've talked about this a lot. I think we're getting some numbers in on that, pretty substantially saying no. I think we can, leave it open just one more second here. All right.
Ending the poll.
Okay, great. So looks like about 12% saying yes, 64 saying no, and 20% unsure and 4 no opinion. So with that, I think we can move to our last poll slide, which is sort of the overall question that we have for the group. That is, should WEDI recommend the updated and new operating rules? And Michael, let's keep this open just a little bit longer. Make sure everybody, and please weigh in on this. Very important that you know how you feel about these operating rules. We'll give it another 5 seconds. Please get your vote in. All right, I think we can end the poll. Right, got one more. So it looks like 32% saying yes, move ahead with all of them. 20% saying yes, but not the attachments rule. And we've got Mary Lee saying she does not support the patient attribution rule, and 20% saying no, we should not recommend going forward, and almost 30%, 28 saying they don't know. So very helpful numbers. And with that, I just wanted to thank our facilitators, Donna, Terry, Gail, and Heather, for their excellent work. Very challenging topic, but I think we went through it very, very smoothly. So with that, I think we can move, we can skip this slide. Yeah, thanks, Beth, for the applause. Absolutely well earned from this group. And with that, we can move to our next section, which is the 80-20-837 claim. Our facilitators, Beth Davis, Stanley Knockomson, and Charles Ververka. Take it away.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Just as an introduction, X12 has already submitted to NCVHS a series of recommendations for moving to the next version of the standard, the 80-20 standard for the dental healthcare claim the institutional healthcare claim, the professional healthcare claim, and the healthcare claim and payment advice, or the remittance advice as we fondly know it. Those are the 3 837 transactions and the 835 transaction. We'll start this session to discuss the healthcare claim transactions, and in the next session, we will have the discussion about the healthcare claim payment advice. Again, what we're looking for is not to educate folks about all of the data content changes, but to get your feedback on the importance of making some of the major changes and any of the other implementation issues that might be involved in moving to the next version of the transaction, at least for the claim transactions. So next slide, please. I think we've got first a poll question. We want to know in the audience about your knowledge of the claims transactions, the new version of the claims transactions that were proposed to NCVHS. So if you wouldn't mind, please answering this particular question so we have a sense of where the audience stands on these transactions. We got 28 people answered out of the 29, out of the 61 participants. Oh, 30. Well, let's leave it open for another 5 or 10 seconds. Good, we got over 50%. Thank you very much. And we've got 77% adding the first two that are either very knowledgeable or somewhat knowledgeable about the transaction. So I'm anticipating some good feedback from you all. 19% or 6 of you are slightly knowledgeable, and 1 is not knowledgeable at all of the transactions. Rob, you didn't really have to answer that poll, so that's okay.
Thank you, Stanley.
so that's okay. Anyway, just kidding. So I think we have a fairly knowledgeable group here to help us determine what WEDI's recommendations should be. Next slide, please. This is a series of modifications, and of course, the impact we want to determine of some of these changes. Do we have the full set of modifications on here? The next slide is all. I think we just go to the. Okay, so here's some of the key modifications, and Beth and Chuck, if you want to ask folks any particular changes about any particular changes, now would be the time. Otherwise, we'll go to the NCVHS questions.
Well, I think it would be a good idea just to either pause for a minute and let folks read it, or to just touch on each one to kind of get the juices flowing.
Great. Okay, here's.
Well, I'll just read that. I see that Nancy posted a comment, and I totally agree with this on the first one, that the change of the CAS to the RAS will be significant. I know that our organization has assessed that as significant as well.
Okay, so we've got this was a major change, that CAS to the RAS, just to allow a better synchronization with the payment advice, so that providers can match better the reasoning for any adjustment or declination of a particular line item on any of their claims. So it sounds like it will be a pretty big change, and whether or not it's significant, that would be an issue that I think each provider and health plan will have to determine.
So from the comments, just adding on there, Mike and Nancy are pointing out that while it is a significant change, it's also a significant benefit to the organizations who need to process that type of information with relation to, especially around provider adjustments.
Excellent. All right, and there, another modification, just focused on reducing ambiguity throughout the implementation guide. X12 did some work in trying to clean up some of the situational rules and titles and descriptions of the data elements and segments and loops so that it was more clear. There was a change to allow the assignment code to apply to both Medicare and non-Medicare payers. So it was clear that we weren't, people were not just talking about the Medicare assignment. There were revisions to add some clarity on the real-time use for the healthcare claim transactions. It would be feedback on real time. Anybody have a comment on whether they see much use of real time for the healthcare claim transaction?
I know I'll add to that, because that was kind of my comment, is that the real time is one of the big benefits that we've looked at in applying it toward, say, some of the good faith estimate exchange of data in a predetermination type of claim, and also to be more competitive with some of the offerings through FHIR APIs and the growth of clinical data exchange, much of which is real time. And so supporting this real time is a big deal. So it'd be good to know people's thoughts on that particular aspect. And Terry's saying that he agrees with that. Real time could be helpful for NSA requirements. Nancy says better clarification is good for going forward, but it doesn't address to move off 5010. People doing 5010 understand the reporting requirements. And Mike mentions that there's a significant federal push toward real-time data exchange.
Yeah, and there is, I know for a number of payers especially, there's a significant cost, at least at the moment, in moving from batch to real-time claims data exchange. So it would be interesting to hear sort of the response from payers as to the cost of that. I mean, I agree it'd be great to have real-time decisions on many of the claims, especially those that are auto-adjudicated.
Exactly.
But, you know, what is the cost for that?
And Mary Lee comments that that NSA estimates, of course, are kind of in the same boat as attachments, and we don't really know the technology. Probably expecting different types of technology to be accepted. And we all know that the turnaround times for some of those things, 1 to 3 days, including potentially the convening provider coordination of those things, would almost necessitate real-time adjudication. It's to me, in my mind, it's a little less obvious, as other than the auto adjudication, how much improvement comes in for real-time batch and financial administrative transactions. But it would be good to hear other thoughts on that. Pam says that note that real-time information is available today for 5010, but in a TR2 document, which is a separate document. In 8020, it is brought into the TR3 itself. Thank you, Pam.
Yeah, that's great. So it sounds like X12 has at least prepared these documents to allow for real-time use of healthcare claim transactions. That it's good that that's there. The question is, what will it cost to implement that? Putting the capability in and not requiring, there's no requirement right now for real-time healthcare claim transactions. So in some sense, it's not a cost, but it does add capability.
Yeah, maybe even if there are payers who want to comment on their thoughts for that we can gather, that would be great as well. I know Donna.
Go ahead.
I was just going to mention some of the other comments. Mike says, good to see the real-time guidance move into the 837 version 8020 front matter of the TR3 implementation guide. And Donna says she is a payer and that some organizations like hers already do a form of real-time claims as it's a benefit to the provider and the payer workflow.
And Merrill Lee had earlier said that real-time claims have benefits outside of the No Surprises Act, and they support it.
Good.
So that's great. So we've got an increase in the number of diagnosis code pointers from 8 to 12 per service line for professional claims. There's added support for transmitting coordination of benefit allowed amounts, which certainly would be helpful. Subrogation for payers other than Medicaid. I'd be curious as to the application of that, whether the subrogation is there a lot of subrogation outside of Medicaid?
Good point. Can I interject with a comment from Nancy, which I think is excellent? She says increased diagnosis codes and pointers will be good for social determinants of health and risk adjustment. I was just going to ask, does anybody have any insight into what value that is, or perhaps any associated cost or impact that might be either negative or positive? And we just got a positive in relation to increasing those diagnosis code pointers. Do you see maxing out on those? Do you see a need to routinely go beyond there, or is that fairly common? And then Alex mentions that X12 and HL7 Da Vinci are working on GFE AUB mappings to support NSA for patient cost transparency implementation guide. She's put the link in here, so thank you. And Nancy says it will impact the storage of data, good, and the business implications of that. So that is true. It will make transactions larger potentially.
Now, I will say that I believe even though it allows for the maximum to be increased, there's still no requirement for payer acceptance and processing of all of those transactions. That's my understanding of the way things work is you can submit as many as the transaction allows, but the payers may not process all of those.
That's true.
So that will be. Oh, thank you, Merrill Lee. And so I think that's important in terms of the impact and the understanding that providers and payers are going to have, and an explanation in some of the guides that you may not, or your companion documents, that they will not process any more than X number of diagnoses. There was an increase in the number of prior authorizations and referrals that can be reported at the line level. And there are some additional segments to support the reporting of drug rebate information. So here's some of the modifications. The list of these modifications, I believe, are available at the X12 website. You do not have to be, I think this is one where you have to have a subscription to GLASS, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but you do not have to have a paid subscription. The ability to see this list of modifications is free for anybody to look at. Is that accurate?
Stanley,
Yes.
if I may, yes, the X12 letter to NCVHS has a fairly concise presentation of those changes in their letter, and I'll add to the chat.
Did we lose Chuck?
Chuck, you just put yourself back on mute.
Sorry about that.
That's all right.
And folks can refer to the letter and note where they might wish to comment. So I think that it's broken out between the professional, institutional, and dental within the letter, as well as a separate section on the estimated cost.
Great.
But I just wanted to get that link out there for the folks.
Okay. And Pam has sort of clarified that you do not have to have a subscription to GLASS to view the difference report. You can view them in GLASS. So that's good. So you can see all of the modifications. And again, we hope that folks had an opportunity to look at that ahead of time. So let's move to the next slide, please. NCVHS had some very specific questions in their letter about some of these changes. So we're going to talk about them to allow for WEDI to respond to the specific NCVHS questions. Next slide, please. Regarding costs, has there been any analyses of the cost impacts and of these claim and remittance advice transactions? And has anybody uncovered net positive value, net costs, or anything like that? I know a little tough for folks to do that, but if anybody has done that, feel free to speak up or put something in the chat about it.
I'll just kind of comment to this point that I'm aware of a number of individual organizations who's done some cost analysis, and theirs have been higher than what we've seen in than what we've seen published by some of the benchmarking. If I could, at some point though, I do want to go back and read a couple of the direct messages.
Okay, I've got that one. I've got those Beth, so you can keep explaining what you were talking about. And Nancy has mentioned that she's not aware of studies on the physician side yet. Marilee has said they're still working on the business analysis of the changes. No numbers at this point. So it sounds like for many people, it's somewhat early to do that. Diana Fuller said that her organization has not done a cost analysis. And Gail has mentioned that they have not conducted any analyses to date. The time needed is significant, especially when other federal requirements must be implemented currently. I'm assuming she's talking about some of the No Surprises Act and connectivity and interoperability requirements. So this is a difficult time for folks. Correct. Wow. We should note that there are some significant changes. However, Marilee, what would you consider the significant changes? And you can speak up if you'd like. Or not. Marilee, do you want to say anything about which changes you consider significant? Okay, I'm not hearing her. I'm just responding to what she said in the chat. Okay, CAS, the CAS to RAS and the diagnosis code support are both considered significant from her organization standpoint. So I think we do want to say that some of we already know that there are some significant changes to the transaction.
Nancy has raised her hand as well. Yep.
Go ahead, Nancy.
Sure. I was just going to run through some of the overarching summary things that I've come up with looking at the 837P specifically. I think that a couple of the significant changes are going to be, or it's more than just a couple, the length of field changes, and that happens in multiple data fields, and I don't have them written down specifically, but there are some where they've expanded or they have decreased. And so changing those field lengths, and again, that's gonna, if they're lengthened, then that's gonna cause some data storage changes. There's also, in doing those field length changes, that is one area that was pointed out as may cause a problem if you try to have compatibility between versions 5010 and 8020 across transactions, because if a field has increased and you're filling that up in 8020, but then you're trying to convert or to exchange with someone who's on 5010, then that would get truncated, and whether or not you would lose the meaning in that data would be a question. There's some of the changes that are going to happen. We've touched on a couple of them. There's a question about whether or not there's going to be industry adoption of it, like we were saying about the subrogation. There's also the factoring agent. There's quite a number of changes that deal with that, but not sure exactly what the uptake will be on that. Unique device identifier, I think there's a separate slide all about that, but not sure yet what the uptake will be on that, the predetermination. And then there's a couple other, the new 2 segment probably will have limited usage because that's related to oral surgery services. Those revised drug information segments, if it's having to do with the dispensing of drugs out of a provider physician office, that's a pretty limited situation where that happens. So those are just some of the things that we're seeing as changes, but not quite sure if they're going to be in and of themselves big. I think the question then becomes, as you start to, add these together, do you start to see the significant benefits that come as you build on each of the smaller sort of benefits?
So
I'll stop there.
That's great, Nancy, and it sounds like there's got to be a consideration of the business impact as well as the IT impact of, putting the data element in there is one question, but the requirement to collect the data and the use of the data is something else. But both will incur some costs. Is that a fair thing to say?
Yeah, and I think for some of those that I was pointing out about whether or not the uptake is going to be, so if you're building out, you're building out for that factoring agent, and then you find out no one's doing it, so you built for not, and no one came. That would be another piece of the cost and benefit.
And that lends itself toward Ed's earlier comment that I didn't read out, but he mentions that an increase in diagnosis codes would require heavier application database work to truly consume the additional codes for health plans. And he would think that PMS systems would also have heavy integration work to transmit the codes. And for Stanley's comment, if there is a diagnosis code that represents a risk condition in elements 13+, that would be a meaningful miss.
Absolutely. So it does, and it sounds like, we're aware that there are significant changes. We've mentioned a couple of them, but but a lot of organizations are still in the midst or haven't even started the cost benefit impacts. And it may be a little early to come to a conclusion on those. Is that, that's just what, that's my takeaway from this. Does anybody else have the same sort of understanding as I do?
We may want to go to the next slide, the poll slide,
Okay,
Stanley, because that'll ask the question, I think.
excellent. Probably should have done the poll before we developed the question, but so let's open up poll question 10, the analysis and impact of the change to the new X12 transactions. Take a look and see if you can answer whether or not you've done an analysis or when you will. Okay. And there, Okay, I think we're good. We can end the poll. Then, Michael, you're still running it? Great. One person, one respondent has said they've already conducted an analysis. 7 plan to conduct an analysis within the next year. 9, a greater percentage, say that they're only going to conduct an analysis when there's a proposed rule, and a number say they will only conduct an analysis on the final rule. 5 said that they have no plans to conduct an analysis. Interesting. So it sort of fits in with, hey, no one's done, not a lot of people have done the complete work yet. Tough to answer this question. Seems to be some stuff going on in the chat. Oh, sorry.
You want me to read some of these that we haven't read aloud yet?
Sure.
Okay, so a lot of people agree with Nancy. And Diana says that according to HIPAA, you have to respond to the same standard that you received the transaction in. So if you get a claim in 8020, you have to respond with a 999, TA1, and 835 in the 8020. Then if the 837 comes in 5010, then you respond in 999, TA1, 835, and 5010. The payer health plan has to have a system that can handle all these versions, which means more technical issues, more maintenance, and more errors can happen. And I would add that clearinghouses would also have that same issue. And then Mary Lee says, clarification, HIPAA did not name the acknowledgements. And then Diane says, I know, but for those that do respond with 999 for every transaction, the same rule applies logically. And so Nancy said, so need to use the same version of 277CA with the 837. Okay, Gail says, I can't actually respond to the poll. We'd start official gap analysis upon an NPRM. We might do some very high level, not data element level, to provide formal comments to the agency at NCVHS. That's a good point. And then Donna says that we do a rough initial assessment if we feel there's traction to move forward. Until then, we're playing with today's technology that could change quite a bit in months and quarters to come. So the assessment from a technology since today may be moot or somewhat invalid if we don't hear anything for 6 to 9 more months. I get that, the moving target kind of thing, okay. Waiting on a regulation.
All right, Beth, I've been asked to sort of move us along. Sure. We've got 3 more polls and about 8 minutes. I will point out to the folks that almost all of these changes that X12 have made were made in response to a request from at least one person in the industry to fulfill a business need. So it's kind of interesting that we're still debating the requests that at least X12 felt were necessary to move forward. Let's go to the next slide, please. An operational assessment of the workflow analysis and process improvements. I think that's even a step beyond do we have a poll on this? Does the next slide indicate a poll? Nope. Okay, let me just, let's go back to that. Has anybody, if we can go back one slide, has anyone conducted an operational or workflow analysis of the impact of transitioning? Has anybody done that? Do you want to put something in the chat? I mean, based on what we've heard, I don't think we're going to see a lot of that workflow analysis yet, or are we pretty sure it's too early?
We've got Nancy with a comment.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say that I think that there's a logical order of how this plays out. And I think it sounds like some people are still within their organization trying to get an understanding of what the changes are and what the impact will be from the technical standpoint. And then I think after that, you start to think about what the sort of workflow operational impacts are going to be. So I think that this one might be a step further down the road from the technical changes.
Yeah, and Nancy, with the response that we got, since seems like quite a number of organizations are waiting for an NPRM or a final rule, and even are waiting later this year. I think it's early to ask this question, and I think it's fair to say that there hasn't been a lot of work done on this. So next slide, please. XML schema. There's a proposal to adopt the 820 EDI standard and the XML representation as permitted syntaxes. Any comment on that? Is there a downside to naming them both as permissible syntaxes? And is there one, whenever you name more than one, are you then requiring a health plan or a provider to support both or only one of them? Beth, you want to?
I apologize. I was
That's all right.
reading through the chat comments and not.
Yeah, I was going to ask you if you wanted to read some of the comments.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So the comments have been in general related to the previous discussion that there's not a lot of investment in detail analysis and cost analysis for the changes and the work until there's more understanding of when it would actually go into effect. There's Mike says there's been many clarifying non-substantive updates in the 80/20, which we expect will result in higher consistency in implementation alignment across trading partners.
Okay, and agree.
Yeah.
Go ahead. And Donna says that she agrees with that, meaning supporting the X12 schema definition would help resolve some of the content versus format discussions, and very interesting to have both allowed, and there's still the question about whether both would be required to be supported. I think that's a clarification that we need to be made. And Alex talked about syntax mappings of the standard have been previously recognized, but XML mappings do not equate to API profiles. Thanks, Alex.
Yes, good point. Thank you.
I think there's a number of questions on this. While it'd be helpful, the question about, do both need to be supported has yet to be answered. And that could be an issue.
Ed made a comment that he thinks it would be awesome to have an XSD simplify, normalize the translation from X12 and XML for those who need to ingest XML directly.
So right now, Ed, if I understand that, could someone take an X12 transaction in its native format and themselves translate it into XML to digest it?
Ed has his hand raised. Do we need to unmute?
Can somebody unmute Ed?
Hello, Stanley. I can't type as fast as you asked that question. I'm getting requests from particularly vendors that are doing care management and other sorts of value-added services that have asked me to, on behalf of a health plan or on behalf of a provider, to feed them, claim information or remit type information. And they don't have an EDI gateway, and having an XML schema would really be helpful to simplify, feeding of that information to them. So it's more of a clearinghouse software vendor sort of a need, but I think also for anyone who ingests the data, I think that would be a nice option.
And I'll just add
But
on
it's-
to that Mike comments that just a reminder that API enablement can be supported regardless of the underlying format syntax standard.
Okay. I'm going to move us forward. Next slide, please. Do you support the proposal to adopt the EDI standard in the XML representation as permitted syntaxes? And I know Jonathan has a comment on that. There's a 50% right now, 50% yes, 10% no, and a 40%. I've got to, hope I didn't, allowed, not required for both then. Yeah.
Sounds like a qualified yes.
Yeah, there's a support. Jonathan was mentioning that support for both would have to be optional. Agree with Jonathan. It sounds like, we could say there's nothing wrong with supporting the XML format, but we may not want it required. But
exactly. Yes.
Okay, next slide, please. There we go. Fire crosswalks. X12 indicated it intends to provide fire crosswalks for the X12 version 8020 transaction in time for inclusion in the federal rulemaking. Comment on how fire crosswalks would apply the implementation of the HIPAA claims and remittance advice transaction standards. Do we have a poll on this? Is the next one a poll? Oh, no, next one is my favorite. Let's go back to the fire. How fire crosswalks would apply to the implementation of HIPAA claims and remittance advice transaction standards. I assume that means that would make it easier to enable fire APIs for these transactions. Is that correct? And what comments do people have about the use of the fire crosswalks?
My guess is we have similar comments to the previous, and that these should be supported but not required.
Maybe this would and maybe we could put it in the supported but not required at this time and look at the implementation. And if there's enough implementation, we could later require the support for fire or XML.
Sure, or a choice, right, or a choice between multiple supported standards. Ed says he suggests that if there is an emerging Da Vinci or other HL7 accelerator use case like prior auth, transparency, EOB, those would be very helpful. And I think those are good points. Is that maybe they're not required for, say, claim and remit, but more of the outlier transactions that are being adopted as they go. So, and Mary Lee says allowed as part of support for additional standards, but not required. So that seems to be consensus.
And Terry said support for EDI would need to be required with support for both optional.
Right.
I think, and Jonathan mentioned that allowing for these fire crosswalks and supporting them would drive the creation and adoption of a standard fire implementation guide. Okay. So allowed, but not required. All right, next slide, please. There's the inclusion on a situational basis of the UDI. It's also remind folks that it's also an element in the U.S. core data set for interoperability found in certified electronic health records and in standardized hospital discharge reports. Value that the DI and or the UDI provide as data elements. Of course, there was a lot of discussion at X12 about this. There's a whole list of values that the DI provides for health plans, for collection of data, for tracking of the quality and outputs, for inclusion in all payer claims databases. And I know that there was a lot of controversy about this. Do we have a poll on this one, or do we want to have a discussion on it? Okay, there's the level of potential additional value that DI and UDI provide as data elements.
Stanley, probably we need to wrap this up in the next 5 minutes or so that we can move on to the
Okay, so let's we'll do the poll. And there is, lukewarm support. A number of people agree that there is somewhat or significant improved value, and some see no change in value or a decrease in value. UDI is, in very particular situations for high-risk implantable devices, so it's somewhat limited in its inclusion in the claim. Okay. Let's close this one and move on to the next, please. Next slide. No uniform definition of high risk. You're absolutely right, Terry. Last poll question: should WEDI recommend adoption of the proposed new standards? What is the opinion of the group? Going to let this run for a while so we get a goodly number of responses. I know folks aren't thinking about it. And good. Looks like we've got the majority saying yes. Okay. And sorry, I got to check. Got it. Okay, the poll is closed with is the majority saying that, and Ed has mentioned that we'd like to see a true pilot study. That would certainly be helpful. Do we have another slide on this, or are we ready to move to remittance advice?
Yeah, I think we're ready to move to the 835. And Ed, we actually have a poll question later on that exact issue. So very good. So let me thank Beth, Stanley, and Chuck for excellent facilitation of a very interesting and complex issue. No less so is the 835. So we'll move directly into that. Pam and Pat, thank you so much for facilitating this section of the program.
Sure, thanks, Rob. Let's go to the next slide, please. So we're starting out with a polling question like we have in the other areas. Rate your level of knowledge with the 80/20 835 remittance advice transaction. So go ahead and respond to that poll. We should have some Jeopardy music. Still moving a little bit. All right, it looks like we can go ahead and close that out. Most people have responded. So based on these answers, 25 responded, 24% very knowledgeable, almost half were somewhat knowledgeable, and then another almost half slightly knowledgeable or not knowledgeable at all. So again, we've published information in the chat already on where you can go at x12.org to find the complete list of changes in the difference documents. And if you'll go to the next slide. Here we go. We'll just run through a quick list of some of the high level changes that have been published by X12. So just starting out, we've already talked about the UDI in relation to the 837, and the 835 was modified for that as well. So again, I would expect some of the same feedback around UDI for the 835. We've also already talked about real-time adjudication in relation to the 837. And again, that's added for the 835. And as I mentioned before, those instructions actually existed before. They just were in a separate document, in a TR2 document. So as part of 8020, it was brought into the TR3s, gives it more visibility, makes it a little bit more present on here's how to do that. Within the 835, we added the ability to report remittance information related to card payments. So again, it doesn't say you're mandated to do a card payment. It's not related to the payment itself. It's related to the ability to provide an 835 for a card payment, which is not available today. We do have a comment in the chat. UDI in the 835 is necessary because it's replaced the NDCs for submitting drug supplies on claims. So that is an important note back on the UDI, that it is necessary because those NDCs were replaced. I know when we discussed this on Monday, there were other situations, supplies, implants, and explants that were really dependent on the trading partners and their usage. So there's some situational usage, but some situations where the UDI is actually required. Then we have the big one that we've talked about a little bit already, replacing the CAS with the RAS, and the fact that it's a large change, but it's very needed. It provides the ability to support all of the reasons going along with an amount. So all of the CARCs, all of the RARCs that are related to a specific amount, reported all at one time. So you get all of the reasons that go along with that. You don't have to resubmit a claim over and over to get it's denied, 08 is denied again, 08 is denied again. So very highly needed change, but again, a big impact. It's a big change. Nancy also put a comment in the chat. Working on changing CAS to RAS started years ago after the 5010 was finished, and that's true. It actually appeared in 6020. So RAS has been present for a long time, and it's been needed for a long time. And this next one about the remark codes kind of goes along with the RAS. We've always had the ability to report remark codes that are not associated with an adjustment code. This one is just it's making it in a consistent location. So we've changed the location those are reported, so you get remark codes in the RAS segment. And if there's remark codes that are not associated with a specific adjustment code, they can be reported in a different place. And then we actually added a new remark code list that gives some flexibility for some of the specialty industries like property and casualty to report their remark codes as well. And then we completely revamped and standardized the section talking about reporting COB adjudication information. So how to report COB in the 835 has been completely revamped within the front matter section with a lot of specific examples and very clear information on exactly how to do COB information, which also has been really needed because that's a big pain point for a lot of providers, very confusing on how to do that. So we completely redid that and clarified how to do COB. I'll stop there just for a minute to see if there's any other comments on impact of these before I hand it off to Pat to go through the rest of the list.
And there is a comment in the chat from Nancy. She says the UDI in the 835 is necessary because UDI has replaced national drug codes for submitting drug supplies on claims, and work on changing CAS to RAS started years ago after the 5010 was finished.
Great, well then I'll hand it off to Pat to go through the rest of the list. Pat?
Okay. Okay,
Oh, there
sorry.
you go.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
I was double muted. Okay. So we also we standardized forward balancing and overpayment recovery processes. Huge revamping of that, kind of picked the best of the options that used to be there and gave the directions on how to do that overpayment forward balance. Along with that, another critical one is the ability to reassociate a recovery amount to a specific claim. So that's for the forward balance overpayment recovery. And in reporting the ref ID, it now will link back to the claim that was the cause of that forward balance overpayment recovery. That's a huge win for providers because they need to track that to that level of claim detail. We've also enhanced reporting DRG with, originally in 5010 there was a single DRG. And now there are many different various types, different lengths, different information about it. So now all and any DRGs can be reported. We've added a granular to report the source of payment typology is used to talk about the source of the payment. What is the source? Was it a Medicare payment, a Medicaid payment? But even drills down much further than that. Is it a PPO? Is it an HMO? And all the different granularity. That source of payment typology is a national standard code list that we have incorporated into the 835. And the last one to mention is the ability to exchange more detailed patient responsibility information. Okay, so any other comments at this point or questions?
Yeah, Pat, we've got one comment. The remittance sub-work group reports that these two have a big impact, but are very needed and beneficial.
Okay, great. And we agreed too when they were built, so, okay. All right, next slide. Okay, I'll hand it back to Pam for this next, the next slide.
Next slide, please. Okay, so having some discussion about some of the questions that have been posed by NCVHS. And this one actually relates specifically to claims, but it's looking at alternative payment models and value-based payments. Does X12 8020 support value-based payment claims? In what ways does 8020 accommodate APMs, such as medical homes or accountable care organizations? And what are the implications of this to HIPAA administrative simplification policies and continued innovation of non-fee-for-service business models? So does 8020 help promote moving towards value-based payments, alternative payment models, and does it help promote innovation in a non-fee-for-service model? Any thoughts on that? Okay, so we do have a polling question. Let's go ahead and bring that up based on this discussion question. Rate the level of potential value that 8020 transactions will have on value-based payments and alternative payment models. And while this polling is coming up, I'm just going to say, what the heck? There was so much discussion around 837 and no, not that much discussion around 835. So what the heck? All right, looks like it stopped changing, so we can go ahead and close out the poll. And based on the responses here, nobody knows. We don't really know what the impact would be on value-based payments for 8020. Just a couple of responses saying it would either significantly or somewhat improve the value, but basically nobody knows. Okay, so moving on to the next question, I'm handing it back off to Pat for this one.
Okay, so X12 indicated that there were over 2,000 changes identified in the change logs. Now, let me clarify for those who haven't had a chance to look at this. 2,000 is a scary number, and that's pretty much across all of the 837s, 835, and it's actually probably higher. But understand that a lot of the changes to the transactions were clarity to notes, to clarify usage, or in the reporting of the data. Much of that is really non-substantive in nature. Now, not all. Again, we're listing all the things that have a high impact from the transactional technical side, business side, but there are a lot of changes. So don't let a 2,000 number scare you. So in your organization, so this is again a question, in your organization, if you have conducted assessments, which I believe we've already established that no one has, is there any determination with respect to reducing burden on payers or providers? So I'm feeling like this was already been answered when we were discussing the 837. But does anybody have any comments or thoughts on the opportunity? What is the opportunity cost of remaining on version 5010 and not implementing the updated 8020s? And then that ties into the risk of not adopting 8020. Any other additional thoughts? Has it?
Sorry. Nancy has her hand raised.
Yeah, I was just going to say that I think when you start to look at these changes, the 2,000 changes, and then you start to group them together, come up with, buckets for them of, this was language that was just clarified, but doesn't really change the overall intent. There's, a lot of changes to remove things that were outdated, like stuff about MPI implementation, IC10 implementation.
Right.
So, some of that becomes really irrelevant because from a business standpoint, technical standpoint, you've adapted to those changes. So some of those changes, really don't play any role in, moving forward. I think it's starting to then figure out, well, which ones do apply. And even there, again, if you group things together, like, oh, these are all the ones where the data fields have been extended or reduced, or, these are new functions, but what's the adoption level? I think that's what, where organizations sort of need to start with understanding, because like you said, 2,000 sounds like a lot, but when you start to really boil it down, what does impact your organization? And then that's where you can start to then figure out, okay, if we adopt 80/20, what does that mean? Or if we don't, what's the risk if we don't move to 80/20?
And if I could jump in with some comments from the chat, just to go back to the value-based care issue. Mary Lee writes, I think this is based on the same premise as the patient attribution issue we discussed earlier. There's just simply not enough information, not enough base, and value-based care is not yet mature enough. Cindy agreed with that. Mike wrote, although I assume that existing and recommended standards are already supporting value-based care models, as there does not appear to be industry discussion otherwise, ? So very interesting. And then Susan weighed in with remits should be 80/20 if claims are 80/20. Otherwise, it will be very difficult to support and maintain systems. And Mike replies, thus X12, including 837 and 835 together in this first round of recommendations. Thanks.
Yeah, that was the whole purpose. They always go hand in hand. That makes a lot of sense. Okay, let's see any more comments. Do you want to go to the next slide? I think we have a polling question. Rate the likelihood that implementation of these 4 administrative transactions will reduce the burden for health plans and providers. So let's get that poll started. So we have reduced burden and increased burden in here in these responses. Okay. Like 18, I'm not seeing any more. So, 19. Okay, so the reduced burden, okay, so it's about 32%. Reduced burden and increased burden is only about 10%, no change in burden. And then, of course, there's the unknown. Without the analysis and the deep dive, it's really kind of hard to know right now. Okay, and I think there's one more slide in our section. Okay, overall, should WEDI recommend adoption of the proposed 80/20 835? And we'll start that one. I don't see any other questions yet either, so keep an eye on questions, comments. Okay, 42 people have responded. We have 45% yes, 18% no, and 36 don't know. Okay. And I think that actually might be the end of ours. If you can go ahead to the next slide. How much are we done?
And Donna says she can't vote, but she says, yes, we need to move forward.
Okay, great. Thank you, Donna. We'll add you +1 there. Okay, and I think that ends our section. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, Pam and Pat, thank you so much. Good discussion on the 835. And that brings us to our last section, which is sort of combining the two and talking about some of the key implementation issues that the industry would face implementing operating rules and or transaction standards. So joining me will be Nancy and Stanley. So I think we can go to the next slide. Next slide. So what we are doing here is we're going to have a discussion of the question raised by NCVHS, and then we'll do a poll question, and then we'll review the question asked in the survey just to sort of see what the differences are, if there are any. Mike asks, there's a need to clarify burden to implement or value, reduce burden once implemented. I think very good point. So I'll start with this one, and then we'll tag team with Stanley and Nancy. But the implementation timeframe issue was raised by NCVHS. HIPAA provides for a 2-year implementation window for health plans and providers. So one of the questions we have is, do we need additional time longer than 2 years from publication date of the final rule? Past practice generally stipulates a January 1 implementation date. However, NCVHS has indicated they've heard that going live on January 1 could be problematic. So I'd be interested to hear from folks either by raising your hand or putting your comments into the chat. January 1, good for some folks, not good for others. Perhaps it's mid-year if you're doing a fiscal year approach. What would be the argument for not wanting to start at the first of the year, for example? Any thoughts on that? I don't know, Nancy or Stanley? Yep.
Yeah, I think what we've heard, or the industry has said before, what I've heard from industry is that there's a lot of other implementations that happen, like the, updates to ICD, they go updates to CPT. There's a lot of other implementations. Yeah, that's what Terry's just saying now.
And no lack of requirements to meet, for sure.
Oh, yes, and then the holidays
Yep.
and what
Good.
that does to people wanting to take time off, yes.
I think the same would apply to releasing proposed rules at the end of the year, right before the big holidays. But yeah, Chris says January 1 falls into all of the holidays, I think. And Mary Lee says plan renewals and new business generally fall on a 1-to-1 or 7-1. Suggest staying away from those dates, and also suggest earlier in the year rather than late or fourth quarter. Beth agrees with these comments.
It's interesting because some of the other rules that have come out, it's based on the publication of the rule, like some of those price transparency. There were some wonky dates, like, May such and such that. So it's interesting that where there's some regulations that go just off of what the publication is versus, picking a January 1.
Yep, and Mike mentions many organizations also have a change freeze during the end of year holiday timeframe. Aaron says, what about potentially 10-1 to align with the fiscal year? Chuck is asking, is there a consensus on a March 31st, April 1st date? April 1st might be problematic, being April Fool's Day.
Rob, I see
Emily
Gail's
says,
got
sounds
her
like-
hand up if you want to go to her.
Absolutely. Gail, please go ahead.
Thanks, Rob. So a couple of things. One, October 1 to September 30th is not a fiscal year for everyone. So if such a time frame would be considered, it shouldn't be considered because it's a fiscal year, because a lot of us work on calendar year fiscal years.
Yep.
In the past, I think the reason that these kind of rules had an effective date that was after the date of the published rule is because of knowing there was work to be done to even get to the point where you could implement. So it's not an unstandard practice for them to do that. Without knowing what the changes ultimately are and what the impacts are, it's very difficult to even talk about what an appropriate effective date where you have to be able to implement is at this point in time. Because while yes, January 1 is at the end of holidays, a lot of us have releases sometimes quarterly. And so thinking April 1st or October 1st will also run into quarterly release schedules, which depending again, when something would need to be implemented, you may not have development time to do. The third quarter in a year is an open enrollment. So that's a huge impact to payers. So I don't know that, I think we want to be careful in saying, oh, this is the right time frame. There's a lot of huge conversations that would need to happen around that.
No, all good points. And Donna mentions we would have a large body of projects, programs with work streams, and wouldn't necessarily have the same folks for a 1-1 and a 7-1 contract renewals. She notes we would never hold a mandate hostage for a freeze period. And Stanley says correctly, sounds like no date is any good. I guess the argument would be the first Monday of the 13th month for mandates. But
Rob, I wonder though, if this is a question where a WEDI response could be that this a better implementation date or the implementation date is something that would be better solicited in the NPRM, because at that point, organizations would have done more analysis and might have a better understanding of how much work it will take to implement the changes. So
no,
maybe that's something that it's too soon for the industry to be able to answer this. And,
a great point. And yeah, until you know exactly what you have to implement, it's hard to understand how much, how many resources you'll need to allocate, how much time you'll need, all of these things. But even if the start date was a particular date, one of the questions, and if we go to the next slide, we've got a question on this, is, do we need longer than 2 years from publication date of the final rule? So, Michael, if you could pull up that poll, we'll get a sense of if folks need. Now, what's happened in the past, of course, is they've had a 2-year period that has been extended because industry was not ready.
Yeah, and it's interesting too, Rob, because I think the requirement in HIPAA is 2 years for new rules, but if it's an update, you could, the secretary, however it's worded, there could be a shorter implementation. I think 6 months was the minimum. So it's interesting that.
Great point.
Yeah.
Yeah, but Nancy, I thought the ACA actually revised that to say it has to be a minimum of 27 months for any changes. But then again, there's also the opportunity for interim final rules and things like that. And what's sort of not considered is what if we're staggering the transactions? Can some be done in less than 2 years and others be done in more than 2 years? It's not as, unfortunately, it's not as straightforward as answering this thing, yes or no.
Yeah, and
I would just want to go back. Pam made a great comment in the chat. If it's longer than 2 years, everyone will still wait until the last minute to implement.
It could be 10 years and we'll still complain that we're not ready. So yeah, I think very good point. Chuck mentions, can we provide a list of pros and cons for each quarter as an implementation date and suggest NCVHS include in their solicitation? I think a good point. Alex states implementation date selection and related viability is also impacted by the other obligations and regulations at play. I think that's a critical point. We have to see what's going on at the same time. And I think that should be part of the comments that WEDI makes, is to make sure that they're spaced out enough so organizations have enough time and resources. Mike says it depends if multiple versions of a standard are allowed for a recent NCVHS recommendation. And we do have a slide on that, Mike, a little bit later. So I think that's a very important point. Jonathan says staggering is better, agrees with Stanley. Donna says 2 years sounds like a long time, but with the usual and customary analysis paralysis, it could be 12 months of analysis and then 1 year for actual development. Hang on 1 second, Stanley, I'll just get through the comments. Gail says the amount of time, whether 2 years more or less by transaction, really needs to be dependent upon the volume and magnitude of changes. And if staggering, where is it against other efforts? And staggered implementation is very difficult to support, says Susan. I prefer the cutoff, like when we move from 40-10 to 50-10. Great comments. Oh, I think, hold on, maybe one more here. Okay, Stanley, why don't you go ahead?
What's a little bit disturbing is that NCVHS has, over the course of the past several years, done all kinds of studies and discussions on ramping up and aligning standards and things like that. They seem to be asking the same question over and over and over again without ever coming up with an answer. We've discussed this innumerable times. That's one. Secondly, I think looking at the 40-10 to 50-10 movement, it was clear that it did take more than 2 years. I believe there was the extension. So it looks like the industry, especially with all of the other things that are going on, will probably need more than 2 years to do all of this work.
Gotcha.
This is Nancy. I was just going to point to the poll and say that, we have in terms of should it be longer than 2 years, no at 7 out of the 16 respondents, 44%, and then unsure was the 50%, 8 out of the 16 respondents.
Yeah, no, very interesting. The
Yeah.
fact that just one person argued for a longer. And I think it gets back to Pam's comment that no matter what the length of time, we tend to wait until the last minute. I think part of the challenge, certainly on the provider side, is they're waiting on their vendors to take action. And so vendors not being required to do anything other than through contract, that could impact implementation dates as well. I just wanted to. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, the other scenario that's been talked about, going back to when we had the 5010 implementation discussion, was should certain stakeholders be have an earlier implementation date? So, like the clearinghouses, the payers, so that they're ready to go, and then the providers, staging it that way. Because if everybody's trying to implement up until the last minute, how do you get up and running if your clearinghouse isn't yet up and running and won't be until the final day?
Yep, very good point. We talk about that a little bit later. I think we've got a poll question on that. Alex states implementation efforts should also consider testing and go live with trading partner considerations, just to the point we were just making. And Donna says, wonder when we will entertain the question about 837, 835 and the others as a package to implement, or the 837, 835 with one date and the others come along, we look at them being separate. And then Alex agrees with Nancy, get the systems ready, verify them, then go live. And then Mary Lee agrees with Alex. Mike says, hard to confirm, quote, ready across an entire industry, though. What typically happens, including with WEDI, is we will survey the industry on their readiness. We certainly did that with 4010, 5010, and I-10. So that's one way that we can at least try to gauge the readiness level. And then Alex, question to Mike, would the certification program be one way of trying to get the industry ready?
Rob, just to jump in here and go back to the comment about the 837, 835 combo. What's interesting in this dynamic of how X12 brought the transactions forward, they're bringing them forward in the different groups. And so we are just seeing the 837, the 835, and NCVHS is doing the hearing on just the 837, the 835. And so this is really a time different from what we had done before, where we are only considering these, sort of being asked to consider these somewhat in a vacuum, but yet we all know that there's, a suite that wraps around these 2/4 transactions. So it adds that dynamic of, are we really thinking just 837, 835 for how we respond, or are we really thinking about the whole pie as opposed to just two pieces of the pie?
Gotcha. And Cindy writes, sees this as a implementation that goes on for years. There will be an ongoing impact to support the ongoing implementation of the remaining standards. Donna writes, some implementation challenges could also be within the scope of go lives. Are the interpretations issues? What happens when there's a debate on interpretation? It's easier to battle by a stakeholder, as Nancy pointed out. Maybe a good solution. Clear the smudge first with the clearinghouses, payers, and then weave in the providers after we've stabilized clearinghouse vendor payer implementations. So that's a huge issue. Let's move to the next slide, Michael, if you don't mind, and we'll I don't know, Nancy, if you wanted to take this one.
So the next up is around implementation. Recently recommended potential concurrent use of multiple versions of a standard over an extended period of time. Would industry benefit from being able to use either the version 8020 or version 5010 for some extended period of time versus having a definitive cutover date? So I will say that, you know, what I brought up earlier, I think closer analysis needs to be done to see how compatible you would be on multiple versions of, say, the claim between 8020 and 5010 and the 835, but then the other transactions as well. You know, so how does that all play out? And the one example that I brought up, again, I don't know if this is a real concern, someone would have to do more analysis, is the fact that some of these data fields have been extended for 8020, but if you're then, you know, another trading partner or whatever, is on version 5010 or someone else in that chain, then they're going to truncate that and not be able to accommodate that longer data field. So is that something that makes this like not compatible to do between versions?
Yeah, and I'll say Marilyn wrote that she would support multiple standards for a transition period, but not indefinitely. This system impact definitely needs to be detailed in an analysis, and both Pam and Pat agreed with Marilee. Jonathan writes, most of these suggestions imply supporting both anyway. Gail agrees with Marilee on multiple standards and system impact. Mike writes, if allowed, only, in quotation marks, only 2 versions of a standard to coexist would be recommended. More than 2 increases the cost and complexity significantly from both a technical and operational perspective. Pat writes, like the conversion from CAS to RAS, we can use a conversion plan for element to element. And then Kathleen agrees with Mike on his point. Great comments. And just a good point. Yeah, Marilee, just to clarify, we are talking about versions of the same standard, not multiple technology formats. And yes, you're correct. And I think, Nancy, we've got a slide, a poll on this one here, so we can see what folks think.
So since there's a versus, let's make sure. Would industry benefit from being able to use either the version 8020 or 5010 for some extended period of time versus having a cutover? So you're answering, would there be a benefit to allowing both for an extended period of time? So we'll let people continue to weigh in on that. Okay, seems like they've stopped. So we've got majority 12 out of 23, 52% saying no, and then followed by 6 out of 24, 25% saying yes, then unsure, don't know. So looks like a clear winner there, no runoff needed on that election.
If we can go to the next slide, I think we've got a snapshot of the. Oh no, we don't. Okay, now we'll just keep moving forward. Stanley, do you want to take the next one?
Sure. And the question is, are there impacts, limitations, or barriers for just advancing to version 8020 of the claim and remittance advice standard transaction while we're using version 5010 of the other mandatory transactions? Is there anything that would prevent that from happening? Are there positives or negatives from moving only the claim or remittance advice standard forward?
I have a question. So this is data impacts, limitations, barriers.
So in other words, they're saying, what
Yeah.
if we said move forward?
Move forward, yeah.
80/20 for just the claim or remittance advice for a while. Oh, and not move forward on the other transactions for a while.
So essentially what you would be doing is, or would be making decisions about the transactions potentially in the groupings as they come out from X12. So right now we've got the 837s and the 835. And so the question is, do we, make recommendations and have, Secretary CMS move forward on proposed rule and get that implementation ball rolling, and then, knowing that, but the other groups of transactions will be coming afterwards. I think that what concerns me about this approach goes back to what we just talked about with implementation, and just there's so many different things that we know are coming along to be implemented. Attachments, there's No Surprises Act, GFE, AEOB. Everybody can name all the different requirements that are coming along. So I guess the question is, what happens if resources start to become limited? And yes, we've done the 837, the 835 in the next round or whatever, thinking that we're going to get them all at some point, but then people start running out of resources, time, whatnot. And then as we get to the later groupings, there's more of a struggle in the industry to be able to get that work done, if that makes sense.
And
yes,
I'll go through some of the chat comments. A couple refer to the previous issue. Chuck writes, using a definitive cutover date has the advantage on the payer side of rallying both technical and business support teams to focus on file exchange simultaneously on the cutover date. Chris writes, with possible staggered implementation deadlines, it could be 2 to 3 years before first go live and the last one of the standards transactions and possible attachments. Mary Lee writes, the presentation of the transactions in these logical groups also raises the potential that only some would move forward at all. Adoption of the entire group is not a guarantee. Pam writes, keeping in mind that X12 is moving to an annual release cycle, very important, with potential beneficial enhancements being added annually, the more we delay implementation of the current version 80/20, the further behind we get, and it becomes a bigger and bigger deal to implement. Once we get current with the annual cycle, implementations become much smaller and therefore easier. Just a second, Stanley, I just read Donna's here. I think we need to do a deep dive to see if there are any limitations in terms of element segment requirements that may have dependencies, operating rules, data format requirements. If there are none, then I don't see an issue. If there are some, then we have a bit of a problem keeping the EDI workflow. It may be hard to have a claim pay on a service that we may not be able to support because we don't tell the provider it's a covered service benefit in the explanation of benefits, which could be a problem if the 834 isn't yet accommodated, if there's data information there that's needed for benefit and contract enrollments. Stanley, sorry.
I think this is one of these questions that's very difficult to answer looking at just the 820 and the 5010, because there are so many other things going on, like the NSA and interoperability and potential claims attachments. How do you factor all those in with this particular question? You can't answer this in a vacuum.
No, good point. To the annual release cycle mentioned by Pam, Chris writes, the annual release cycle could mean that there could be a perpetual process of upgrades, even if new versions are adopted only every 3 years. Version 8020 is calendar year 2021, writes Mike. Donna says, also we're focusing a lot here on 8020, aka X12, but if other named exchanges are involved, like HL7 Fire, we just expand the complexity. I think a very important point. Celine writes to Donna's point, the complexity, but also potentially the cost. So, Michael, we would probably go to the next slide. Okay, and so we got Nancy, do you want to take this one?
Sure. So how important is it that there be an industry ROI established prior to administrative standard being mandated? So there's a lot of talk about knowing what the ROI is, but we've talked about a lot of organizations haven't really started that assessment to know what the ROI is going to be. And in saying ROI, I hate to throw a monkey into the question here, but is that ROI that you as your organization has assessed, or would you be wanting to see results of pilots before saying that you're seeing an ROI?
And it's also candidly a chicken and egg question for NCVHS as well, because they want to understand the potential ROI associated with a proposal, but folks can't establish that ROI until the proposal is more firm and they're able to allocate the resources in order to complete the analysis. So it's, again, very challenging for the industry.
So it looks like in our results, kind of split here. The majority is very important with 7 out of 16, the 44%, but then next up is the 25%, 4 out of 16 of somewhat unimportant. So we're kind of mixed there, and then follow up with a couple saying important, a couple saying don't know, and one saying somewhat important.
Excellent. And Michael, if you go to the next slide, we'll get a glimpse into what the survey results indicated. And so you can see.
So here we had, this specifically brought in the piece about it shouldn't be mandated until there's a pilot test and results indicate a clear return on investment. So this defines that ROI piece with the pilot test, as opposed to just organizations figuring out their own analysis for ROI. So we are seeing here, no one strongly opposed, no administrative, so oppose was 10. So you're looking for people who would be supporting. So strongly support were 11 at almost 23%, 18 support at almost 37%. And then in the middle was the 20% of 10.
Great, and I'll just capture some of the chat here.
Yeah, I think there was quite a bit of a conversation going back a bit. So maybe
gotcha. Yeah.
Don't where they were talking about the
cost.
But yeah.
So to Alex says to Celine's comment, the cost plus provider effort, time drain, staffing, training. I think these days, because of the pandemic, staffing is probably a bigger issue now than ever. And Jonathan agrees. Terry agrees. Gail says making changes cost time and money, and making changes just to change with no benefit other than a change is not a good use of anyone's resources. And I think that may be the definitive statement here, I think. Tyler agrees with Gail. Terry agrees with Gail, seems like a no-brainer, he says. And Mary Lee says, I was just about to type what Gail said. So, yeah, I think extremely important, should have been an option. Good point, Tyler. Heather writes, to Stanley's point about looking at the universe, not a vacuum. In a vacuum, perhaps the 837, 835 changes have benefits. However, are they at the top of everyone's list with the No Surprises Act, attachments, possible PA rule, all of these things? And I think if it goes back to what we're just discussing at the beginning of the program, which is what's the most important administrative transaction change needed by the industry. I think there seems to be consensus around the attachments rule rather than making these changes, Gail said, just for change's sake. And then Tyler, Terry, Celine, all agree. Chuck says concur, but what about quote mandate? That's unclear. Tara says, putting on my X12 hat, I know that Kathy Shepard has shared this in the past. X12 has spun up a proof of concept pilot program. Participating companies are starting to build out these transactions, testing and reporting outcomes. This includes resource costs. So I think that's going to be very important, very interesting to see the results of that program.
And to jump ahead there, I see that Tyler asked the question that I was going to ask, which is when will X12 have findings from these proof of concept pilots? And I don't know if Tara has any insight on that, but and then I see that Tyler again put in just feeling that I'm assuming the unfulfilled promise he's talking about is the idea of having pilots and results that can be shared. Oh, so Tara said there isn't a timeline that we can share at this point.
Correct. And I'll just reference Donna saying at the end of the day, we have do so much within the medical loss ratio too, which doesn't leave us much. So it's a challenge for everybody, I think, is the bottom line. And question from Alex to Donna, is there a medical loss ratio related exception needed for these upgrades, or perhaps that proves the point of the ROI? And then Tyler says, I may be wrong, but I feel like this has been an unfulfilled promise for years. I think there's a renewed interest in the return on investment for all these types of mandates. And I know that's sort of top of mind for NCVHS when they're viewing this. So I think very important.
Yeah, and Rob, in all this discussion, you know, we talk about the ROI and the priorities. That makes it all the more important for us to say, yes, we should move ahead on these, but not until we finish X, Y, and Z. You can give recommendations as to the timing. Is it critical to do this right now or within the next 2 years, or should we be focusing on things like attachments, prior authorization, and the NSA stuff before we worry about upgrading the transactions, because they're doing okay today?
Yeah, I was just thinking of that, Stanley, because I know that people have brought up, well, you know, we've had to implement workarounds to be able to deal with XYZ because it's not in the transaction. And but I guess that gets back to, but they have implemented a workaround, so they've got it working. And as much as it's always that difficulty where, you know, what you have maybe put together with, you know, Band-Aids and rubber bands or whatever the saying is, but you also worry about all the work it takes to get to that next level. And is that a new going to work as well? Or are you still going to be back to, you know, the Band-Aids and rubber bands and what have you?
Well, and Mike asks, I think, the question about what's the opportunity cost if you don't. We may, he says, we also have to ask what is the cost to not implement or update. And I think the argument is, you know, building on the previous additions improves. Is there enough improvement to warrant the investment? I think is the key question. Bob writes, updating to the next version of the transactions would support many of the issues and data needs that Stanley listed. So I think very good comments on this particular issue. So appreciate
It's interesting too, because when you think back on 5010 and implementing that, the industry was forced to have to do that because it couldn't accommodate ICD-10, and ICD-10 was coming. So you kind of wonder, if there hadn't been that ICD-10 factor, would we still be talking about, should we implement 5010? But it makes you think, well, people are talking about ICD-11, and again, the industry could say, well, then let's wait until we have to, same like 5010. But is that really the way we want to be implementing something where we're up against a timeline challenge like that? So the more things to weigh with considering.
Excellent. Michael, if you go to the next slide, I don't know, Stanley, if you wanted to take the next issue.
How important is it that the administrative transactions be implemented on a regular schedule? That is, how important is it for the industry to know that there's going to be an upgrade every X couple of months?
And this, I think, relates back to a comment Pam made in the chat about that X12 is planning on moving more to a regular annual update schedule. That's not to say the industry would update, but they would update their standards on an annual basis. That might be an option for the government to move forward. The benefits, of course, are, as Pam said, the changes would be less severe, less costly, potentially. However, the downside is you would be doing them every year or every 2 years.
Yeah, I think what's interesting on that too is that there isn't as much of an urgency or concern when something is coming along and how's that going to be handled by a transaction, because we can get that change in there and then that would be out in a year or so. So you're not having to develop really comprehensive workarounds to handle something because the updated version could fix that very quickly.
So it does look, as people are reviewing results, it does look like many of our respondents believe it's somewhat to very important. 42, about 2/3 believe that it's on the somewhat important to very important, and about 27% feel that it's very unimportant or somewhat unimportant. So it's certainly leaning towards the more important. It's a good idea. It sounds like it's a good idea. But again, how do you plan for this in regards to all of the other things that are going on?
Yeah, and just jumping into the chat, Donna writes, and curious, jumping years ahead, how much of this conversation or the conversion for 837, 835 will be the same concerns, comments when the next round of transactions surface for recommendation? How much of the comments are reusable and we can get ahead of the curve knowing what the concerns are here for 837, 835 and better prepare ourselves for the other transactions. Gail writes, each standard needs to be evaluated on its own merits. Some go together like claim payment, but to say, for example, that we need to update the claim because a change in the enrollment transaction is needed is not a relevant argument. So I would caution about lumping all transactions into one bucket to consider the options. Chris writes, ICD-11 will eventually be coming, so we need to be on a regular schedule before we get there. So there would only be minimal changes. Tara writes, the annual release cycle, as Pam mentioned, allows X12 to update versions and recommend mandates on a much more regular basis. Donna, in my question above, what can we learn from this experience and better get ourselves prepared? If we're demanding ROI be available industry-wide, that should get going now for those 270 and other 8 series. Gail says there has been no decision made whether or not to move to I-11 for mortality reporting in the US, correct? We heard from CMS at our annual conference that they are looking at this issue and they're moving ahead with some sort of analysis and report of what that change would be. So no guarantee we'll move there, but certainly it's on the CMS radar screen. Mike writes, if a predictable schedule, would there be smaller steps versus huge leaps, which could impact cost and staffing? Rich, Gail, do you mean morbidity? Mortality is not the HIPAA code set. Good point, Rich. I think she meant the code set that would be established, I'm guessing, under HIPAA. And then Mike, I would believe there would be smaller steps if we went to that incremental or annual type of approach. Great comments. You want to move, Michael? Yeah, gotcha. Okay, good. Yeah, having the multitask. Yep. No, we understand, Gail. And if we go to the survey slide, we can see here actually very similar results from the poll. Again, pretty strong support for a regular update. And with that, we can go to the next slide. Nancy, if you wanted to take this one.
So we had quite a lot of discussion about this earlier, but here's the, give your answer. Pick one. Should multiple versions of administrative standards be permitted to be used at the same time? Now, we didn't in this question give the qualifier for, a short period of time or an extended period of time. So we'll just keep it general. See if we can get one more vote, maybe to break the tie. There we go. A couple more votes came in there.
Yeah, and good point from Mary Lee that she's selecting unsure due to the ambiguity.
Yeah. So it does look like we've got, the majority, 43% saying yes, and then no at 35%. And considering the low number of people responding, that's not too much of a difference in terms of the yes and no. But yeah, I think that, maybe if we broke that question out and said, for an extended period of time versus during a limited cutover time, we might have gotten some different or might have been interesting to have broken that question out.
No, good point. Yep. I think we can go to the next slide.
Yeah, this next slide show our survey results.
Yeah.
Okay, so wow, yeah, our survey results. Now, the total number of people answering this question during the survey was 50, which is definitely more than the, 20 we had, but not, certainly what would be considered, complete industry representation there. But yeah, we did have 70% saying no. Followed by the 20% saying yes, and then 10% saying unsure.
Good. I think we can go to the next slide. And Stanley, if you wanted to take this one.
And here we start breaking it down a little bit. The importance of allowing multiple standards in use for only a limited time. This goes to constraining it. Nancy, as you were talking, and to help Mary Lee maybe make a decision on this now, how important is it that we only allow this for a limited time?
See, that's what happens when I don't look ahead on the slides to see what's coming next.
No, actually, based on Mary Lee's comment, we quickly put together this poll. Yeah, Pam asked, does this mean multiple versions or multiple standards? I think we meant multiple versions.
Oh, good point. Yeah, you say multiple standards in use.
Oh, good
Yes,
point.
that's what we meant.
Yeah.
Chuck says, if you believe it shouldn't be allowed, then I would answer unimportant, Chuck, or very unimportant. Dang. Can you change your answer on the poll, Michael?
I don't think so.
Okay.
Election tampering.
No, somebody said they wanted to take their answer back. I just
We
wanted
could
to know
we could restart it if you'd like.
no, I don't think so, though. We'll just have to, there'll probably be a lawsuit after this, or we won't be able to expose the poll results for at least 2 weeks. But okay, the person said you don't have to open it up for her. So the importance of allowing multiple, we're going to say versions. 65% say very or important or very important, and the remainder say it's neither important, very unimportant at 10%, and 20% say don't know. So there's mild support for this, so probably a good idea to allow it for a limited time. And of course, we don't exactly know what multiple versions mean. Does that mean if you send a 50-10, the response has to be back in a 50-10? Or if you send an 80-20, the response has to be back in an 80-20, or can you mix them? So there's still some questions, but looks like people are somewhat favorable to this if we limit the time period. Any comments or anything in the chat? Mike mentioned not more than 2 versions.
Yeah. Yep.
So that's an important distinction.
Now, we did not ask the question, but it is an issue, and that is, what do folks feel about multiple standards for a specific business process, let's say, like prior authorization or something like that? Be interested to hear from folks in the chat what they think about that. One option would be to have the health plan support both, and then a provider could select which one they wanted to leverage. There's pluses and minuses, as you can imagine, costs, supporting 2 workflows.
But that was.
I think so. Sorry, Rob.
I was
going to say maybe we not even go down that path, just because we are talking 837, 835 today in the operating rules.
Sure.
And I was going to say, Nancy, that was part of the discussion in the previous NCVH hearings about revising the administrative simplification process. So yeah. I think that has been talked about. Hopefully folks were aware of that. And there was a fairly robust discussion about that. I think NCVHS in their recommendations to CMS said that that CMS should consider allowing multiple standards.
Hey, this is Heather, and I know we've kind of had some talking around this, if we want to have a straight question about allowing multiple standards for the same business function for an indefinite period of time. And our subwork, or the prior auth subwork group has a white paper process on guidance for electronic inquiry transactions. And something that came up was this very issue. And one of our bullet points is recommending against allowing the same or the different standards for the same business case. And so we kind of put a pin note holder on there to say, wait until after the outcome of this discussion today about what to do with that recommendation. And so I realize there's kind of maybe some concern about like pulling here, but I feel like our group could use guidance about what to do with that bullet, because we were kind of waiting for guidance from this discussion. And I think we've just asked about multiple standards for a limited period of time, but I don't know how others feel about it, but I would appreciate feedback at that point, because we do have that content in our white paper. Thanks.
We do have the ability to do a poll on the fly here. Michael?
But did we answer that question for the previous NCVHS hearings?
It's a good question.
Did WEDI have a policy group before that? No.
We didn't do that, but we did we participated in that listening session. That was in June, right? Am I remembering my years correctly?
Yeah. Yep.
Let me see what I can find.
Margaret mentions in the chat, multiple standards exist today for pharmacy professional services, both NCPDP telecom standard and the 837 professional are supported. So Nancy, do you want us to go ahead and, we're not bound by the results, but it might be interesting to do a poll to get some input from folks on that question.
Sure. Yeah, since Heather raised it as something that the work group is talking about, then we've got an audience here.
Okay. So maybe Michael, would you support permitting multiple standards for a single business process? Yes, no, don't know.
I'm coming, Bill. Come and my butler. Put this in here. Coming.
Thank you, Michael.
Stanley, you might, is Boo causing trouble?
He did yesterday. Oh my goodness, but that's okay. I'll put us on mute so we don't hear him.
We'll give it just a little bit more time. Make sure to weigh in on this, folks. Very important issue.
Closing the poll.
Yep. I think we can close it. So it looks like pretty much photo finish, just one vote between no and yes, and a few with the don't know. So I think that suggests that, I'm not sure WEDI can take a position on this particular issue, but what we could do is recommend NCVHS and ultimately CMS, work with stakeholders to make sure that the right decision is made. So, but yeah, this doesn't give us a definitive answer. I'm not sure if it helped Heather with your paper, but
Thank you for indulging me and letting me kind of barge in and ask a question. I just took a picture of it and we can talk about it in our cell work group call next week. So thank you.
No
And
problem.
Heather, I did find it was the listening session from June 9th that I participated on behalf of WEDI in that. And I have the comments that WEDI, I had drafted and worked off of. So I can share that with you for the sub-work groups work.
That'd be great. Thanks.
Okay, Michael, thank you for that. And I think we can move to the next slide. And this just gives us an overview of the survey results. So we use the term version. So strong support, just a handful opposed. So I think again, allowing multiple versions of standards to be permitted for a designated time, and we put the example of 2 years. So next slide. And Nancy, do you want to take this one?
Sure, we had some conversation around this earlier, but this is the question: how should the government mandate the next iteration of administrative transactions? So all at once, the full suite, several related transactions at once, one transaction at a time, and don't know. Okay. Getting up there with responses. Okay, is that, think we've got everybody, or those who are going to respond have. So it looks like the several related transactions at once hit the 50% mark there of the respondents, and then the all at once full suite came in second. Yeah, I'm just looking at the comments. Tara just said the decision made by X12 to make recommendations for mandate in sequence instead of a full suite was based on industry feedback from the industry and government. Now, what I thought I had heard was that it's not so much that X12 is making a recommendation that they be adopted in the smaller sets of several related transactions, but it was more about bringing them forward to the industry for the industry to analyze, assess, and for NCVHS to do its work. Because when we did 5010, it was such a big bulk of data and transactions that had to be reviewed, that it was more about reviewing them in smaller bites, but not necessarily thinking the intent then would be to adopt them and implement them in the smaller bites. Do you have any insight on that, Tara, or?
And Tara, raise your hand if you'd like to speak, if you don't want to type.
Thank you, Rob. I was it was like my fingers are gonna bleed. And Nancy's right. It's ultimately up to NCVHS and HHS and industry feedback on how these should be implemented. However, the overall goal and what X12 had heard was that these are easier to swallow in smaller bites than in these huge bites. So let's take, for example, that we now have the recommendation out for the 837s and the 835s. And then the next set of recommendations that come out, NCVHS and HHS review those and say, hey, yes, we agree, we're going to mandate all of those. Then those two sets could be mandated and released at the same time. That's still not a full suite. A full suite personally from an Optum perspective, and I remember what it was like at Change Healthcare at 5010. We all know that that was such a huge, major, heavy lift. So I think the idea was to try and make it a little bit more digestible, but that doesn't mean, Nancy, that we couldn't see the 837s, the 835s, and say, just for example, the 270, 271s at the same time. Does that make sense? I don't know that I can give you much more than that without getting a little bit more permission to speak on X12's behalf.
Well, and I think the point that you made about that, industry needs to provide feedback on this because, yeah, we're the ones who have to do the work. So what makes the most sense for us?
Absolutely. And that's part of the reason why I cannot share who else is participating in the pilot due to an NDA, but that's why we're participating in the pilot. So hopefully as we move forward in that, I can most certainly share our experiences from an Optum perspective with this group. It'll be the same thing I share with X12, and maybe that'll help answer some questions.
And I see Terry has put into the chat, and this goes back to a conversation we were having a little while ago, but has sufficient cross-version testing been done to ensure that you can implement them in piecemeal fashion? And I think that's TBD. And I don't know if that's part of the pilots, implementing, just certain ones and I don't know, Tara, if you can speak to if that piecemeal approach is going to be part of the testing.
I think it wasn't formally named as part of the testing, but I think we will find the answer to that as we do this testing, because this is new for us too. Optum's used to the full suite and, doing all the work at one time. So I think we'll have a little bit more of an answer about that. From an Optum perspective, I can provide that as we go through these.
That sounds great. Yeah. And then Chuck said, suggest we consider including the 278 with the 837 and 835 regarding consistency with the attachments issue. So 837, 835, 275, and 278.
The 837 and 835 recommendation has already been made and won't be altered, but there is conversation because of the final rule on attachments coming out on what the next steps on that are going to be. And I'm not privy to all of those details yet.
So again, it sounds like if that is a strong desire by organizations to see those four together, that would be comments to make to NCVHS, so they would know that the industry wants to wait for those two and do some sort of proposed rule. And I'm saying those four because Chuck put those four out there, but we also would need to consider any other versions, transactions. So, wow, I'm just looking at the clock now and seeing that we're already at 3:42. Where are we at, Rob, in the agenda? Should we get
I think we've got one. We can probably skip to the next slide very quickly. We can see here several at once seem to be the consensus of the folks that filled out our survey. So if you go to the next slide, I think we've got one more poll Stanley,
Sure.
maybe I'll give it to you. And we've discussed this a little bit today, but I think it's an important one. So please go ahead.
Absolutely. And this is in regards to the compliance date, and should the government establish the compliance date for all covered entities the same date, or some sort of a rolling compliance with health plans first, then providers and clearinghouses, health plans and clearinghouses first, providers on a later date. I'm sure there are other, there was no other choice, but I'm sure there are some other combinations that are possible. And the returns are coming in. Single choice. Okay. And with the poll closed, we show that 59%, the majority in this case, believe all covered entities should have the same compliance date, with only 32% suggesting plans and clearinghouses first. Nobody suggested or voted for the health plans first and then providers and clearinghouses. On a later date, a couple of people said don't know. So this still looks like the preference is for everybody on the same date. I don't know if there's any other sort of combinations that people think should be done on a rolling basis. If there are, happy to take a comment on that.
And if we go to the next slide, we can see see how closely this tracks with our survey.
Very similar, that all at the same time.
Yep, very similar.
Okay. There was a comment from Jonathan about the major failure of the first round is to allow too much gray area or not mandating covered entities for the 834. I'm not sure what exactly what you meant that about that. I mean, the 834 is covered entities are required to use the 834. It's just that employers are not a covered entity, so they were not required to use the 834. The requirement is that health plans must accept it, but employers.
So in that, Stanley, what you just said sidestepped into a thought I was having, so I'll bring it up. Is this another opportunity, and is there consensus around, should we ask for vendors to be added as covered entities under HIPAA? I don't know if WEDI's had that discussion before, and if we have a position on that. I know it's a question that's brought up from time to time. Okay, I'll take silence as a not interested at this time.
All right. Any last comments on this issue? It seems like we got a fairly strong consensus about moving ahead collectively as an industry rather than individually by stakeholder group. And I think we can skip ahead, Michael, I think to probably 2 slides or so. That's it. Yeah. So Nancy, I don't know if you wanted to just to say a few words. Happy to have Stanley give his thoughts on the day as well, and anyone else.
Yeah, I can just give a little bit of next steps for what we're going to do. So what's going to happen after today? The facilitators are going to take some time to work and compile a lot of this incredible information and the amount of feedback we've gotten. The policy committee will then deliberate over the information as well, including last month's survey results. I think if there's any new questions that come out on areas that we didn't have a chance to cover, we may reach back out either through polling or some sort of a brief survey. In the end, what will happen is we will draft comments that will then, go through the board for approval, and that will get submitted to NCVHS for the request for comment. I believe December 15th is the deadline for that. And then we will also use the information we've gotten today in testimony that we're expecting that we'd be giving in January at the hearing. So I'll switch over to any other summation that you or Stanley or anyone else wants to provide.
I'll just say that I think it's interesting that the idea of prioritization and all of the other things that came up that are coming up for the industry is such a big part of this and needs to be, I think, considered. At least that whole context needs to be considered in the comments. It's not very easy to say, yeah, let's go ahead with implementing new versions without all of the other considerations. I appreciate everybody's contribution and viewpoints. I appreciate I know folks from NCVHS and the federal government were on. I hope that we were able to provide them with some good advice. And I so just remind folks that there's the letter that WEDI will be presenting, that there will be the testimony WEDI will be giving, and then we'll see what the hearings come out with and what the recommendations from NCVHS are. They're not necessarily binding on the department and on CMS. So we've got a long way to go to this. NCVH hearings, then recommendations, then CMS decisions on whether or not to move forward with a proposed rule and how we respond to that. So lots more coming along. And I'm sure WEDI, I'm sure, will keep us posted on everything.
Yeah, no, we will. And before we turn it over to Charles to close us out, I just wanted to personally thank all of the moderators and facilitators for their excellent work. It took a lot of time before this event to prepare. And I also wanted to express my thanks in particular to the NCVHS and CMS folks that not only participated on the event today, but have been working with WEDI to try to make this a better process. So I'll turn it over to Charles to close us out.
Well, thank you very much. And thanks to all of you for sharing your thoughts throughout the last 3 hours, 4 hours. And certainly appreciate your participation. The facilitators did a great job, and I want to thank you. And Rob, great job of being able to pull things together in the chat function and summarize, and especially to Michael, who is running all of the side chats and such. I really appreciate the great job you've done. And to that, we obviously will be back in contact with you as we are developing our comments. And again, thank you. This is what WEDI is all about, is bringing people together in a cooperative fashion like we have done today. Thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.